So if you could please take your seats, and we're going to kick it off to our next session. And our next session is going to look at climate change impacts. So it really is lining up to be another phenomenal opportunity for discussions. And please don't be shy and ask your questions to the panelists and the speakers, because they're a great resource, and they're presenting some amazing science. I was blown away by what we saw in session one. So to chair our session two and moderate it, we have Cynthia Rosenweig. Was that right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. I should have asked you before. I apologize. And so she's a senior research scientist at NASA's GISS at Columbia University in New York. And she brings a wealth of scientific experience. Her CV is really long. And so we're truly, truly honored to have her here with us. She's also the co-founder and member of the executive committee for the Agricultural Model and Intercomparison and Inter-Improvement Project, the AgMIP. And she brings a wealth of information and knowledge on other modeling aspects of the Earth system. And obviously, she's participated in the IPCC report on climate change and a number of other really, really relevant and important exercises nationally and internationally. So Cynthia, without any further ado, if you could take the stage and lead us through the next session. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here for this panel which is on climate impacts. So we know the changing climate is having wide-ranging effects on the ecosystems, carbon cycle that you've all been hearing about. But this panel is taking it even further to look at processes that are going to further linking to human dimensions of climate change, and we're seeing what's happening in the impacts in the oceans. We're going to be looking, of course, at terrestrial ecosystems, but linking to conservation and urban on the land use side to urban areas. So we have a great panel. We want to get to the discussion, as Laura just said. So what I'm going to do is introduce everybody very briefly now, and then we'll go up, and the speakers have, we hope, 12 minutes with time for one question after, in between, or if it goes a little longer, no questions, but let's keep to 15 minutes per person so we can really have some discussion and back and forth. I have a key question for all of you. I hope we can get to that, but also your own questions from the audience. So here we go. First, we go to the oceans with Stephanie Dukowitz, who is a senior research scientist at the Department of Earth, Atmospheric, and Planetary Sciences at MIT. Then we go to our very own Steve Running, who is failing retirement. He said he retired 5 years ago. Steve, it's great to see you. We've been at this for a while together. He's Professor Emeritus, an ecosystem and conservation scientist at the University of Montana. Then when we go to the urban part and the land use and reaching into the urban connections with Karen Cito, who is the director of the Hickson Center for Urban Ecology at Yale University. Our next speaker is Walter Yetz. Is he coming online? Is he here, or is he coming online virtually, or may not be? He is. Okay. So we hope by the time he's up, he'll show up. He is professor of ecology, evolutionary biology, forestry, and environmental studies, also at Yale. And finally, Kim Hall, who's here, she is the climate change ecologist for North America Science at the Nature Conservancy, really linking to these human dimensions, managing the ecosystems, interacting with urban areas. That's also what we want to get to in this panel. So with that, Stephanie, you are up first.
Thank you very much for that introduction. So I have 12 minutes, which means we're going to stay at the bottom of the food web in the oceans, and I'm not going to get to polar bears. Okay. Could you hear me? I hope. Could everybody hear me? I hope. Good. All right. You can hear me? Okay. So the oceans are changing. And how are these changes going to affect the marine ecosystems? So they're warming. So we know that organisms tend to have a range of temperatures in which they can survive. So here I'm showing a plot of diatoms, which are a type of phytoplankton, and how they grow with temperature. Each of those lines is a different species, and so you can see that they have fairly narrow ranges over which they can survive. But also note that warmer adapted species grow faster than cooler adapted species, at least on average. And so we can expect in a warming world to have faster biological rates. There's also going to be less sea ice, and the oceans are going to stratify, so that's going to be keeping phytoplankton closer to the surface of the ocean. Both of those are really going to change how much light is available to phytoplankton. In general, more stratification, less sea ice means more light available to the phytoplankton. On the other hand, more stratification and altered circulations are going to change the amount of nutrients that make it up to the surface of the ocean. On the bottom, I have a model estimate of the percentage change in nitrate supply to the surface ocean by the year 2100 under a sort of high emission scenario. And you can see it's a reduction of at least 20% in almost all parts of the ocean. The oceans are also taking up about a third of the carbon dioxide that we have released. That increases the amount of carbon in the oceans, in the surface ocean. It also lowers the pH, and so this has been termed ocean acidification. And the responses from different species to increased CO2 or lower pH range quite widely. For things that calcify, so any shells, that's quite bad for them. But for the phytoplankton, and that's what I'm showing here is a schematic of what is expected to happen to different phytoplankton types. It looks like, at least initially, increased CO2 relieves some carbon stress, and there might be increase in growth rates with higher CO2 in them. But as we go further out to really high PCO2, there probably is going to be a decrease. So there are all of these different, what we could call stresses occurring all at the same time. And so this is some results from a model where we look at the change in primary production globally over the whole ocean. And if we just look at the effects of warming, so those increased in biological rates, we could actually have an increase in primary production. So that's the red line. On the other hand, this reduction in nutrients, and that's the dark blue line, really suggests a decrease in primary production, likely a reduction in primary production. On the other hand, the ocean acidification, if there is this little increase that happens because of more PCO2 in the water, maybe another increase. And so the global primary production change with all of these effects occurring is actually quite, in fact, it is quite unknown, I think, at this point. Most models suggest a reduction in total primary production, but it really depends on how each of those different stresses is handled in that model. So for instance, regionally, it becomes even more difficult to know what's going on. So this is net primary production. On the right is the change in primary production regionally as based on 13 different Earth system models. So these are models that are being used in the IPCC. And in general, it suggests a reduction in primary production in the lower latitudes and temperate waters, which are already nutrient stressed. But on the other hand, in higher latitudes, with the reduction in sea ice and with these increased temperatures, it suggests that might be an increase in primary production. But what was maybe even more interesting of this figure is the stippling, so that's the little black spots, are suggesting where 80% of the models agree on the sign of the change. And everywhere there isn't a black dot, which is an awful lot of it, they don't agree on the sign of the change. So it really depends on the fact that all of these multiple stresses are happening at the same time. It also depends on how the models are parameterizing things like the increase in biological rates with temperature. Okay, so models are struggling, and there is much more, I'm doing them a disservice, I think, by saying that. But anyway, but we have satellites that have been up for several decades, particularly ocean color satellites. Can they tell us something about how the changes in, say, something like chlorophyll are occurring? So this is NOTIS chlorophyll A trends over a 20-year period. And by the way, there have been several studies that have done sort of similar kind of processes. And I'm sort of trying to point, well, anyway, on the bottom left-hand side. Anyway, what's shown on this part here is if it's blue, it means there's a decrease in chlorophyll. The trend is towards decreased. The red means there's an increase. But the coloring actually itself, the intensity, is the signal to noise ratio. In this case, noise is interannual variability. And if we say, okay, we're going to take a signal to noise, which is kind of about the 95% confidence interval, that it's a significant trend, we land up with this. So the chlorophyll is really inherently noisy, or really large variability from year to year. And so even with a 20-year time series, it is very difficult to actually detect some trends in parts of the ocean, even though our models are suggesting there really is likely to be significant trends over the century. Model studies have actually suggested that it was going to take 30 to 40 years before we will actually have significant trends over most of the ocean. But the chlorophyll is actually a product that comes from remotely sensed reflectance. So what about remotely sensed reflectance? So here are all the visible bands and MODIS showing the significant trends. So that's above the signal to noise ratio of 2. And maybe there's some of those bands show more trends than the chlorophyll. But what happens if we take all of them together? So what happens if we do a multivariate trend detection? So in this sort of schematic, beta 1 at the bottom there could be the trend in, say, the blue remotely sensed reflectance. And beta 2 could be maybe what it is in the green remotely sensed reflectance. Beta with the arrow on top is the vector, which includes both of those. And while beta 1 and beta 2 may not be significant, the uncertainty may be so large that we don't know that there's actually a trend in either of those, the vector beta actually is significant. And here I'm just showing in 2 dimensions, but in fact there's 7 bands. And if we use all 7 bands and do a multivariate trend detection, it suggests that's a significant trend over about 56% of the ocean. So the purple here, again, is the signal to noise ratio. The black stipples are where the chlorophyll showed a significant trend. And so this is actually both exciting and scary. It means that within 20 years, the color of the ocean has changed significantly. We can't actually say what's changed. It's because it's a multivariate, we're looking at all of the bands. We can say color has changed, but we can't say why it's changed. So it could be changes in things like color dissolved organic matter, detritus. It could be changes in the ecosystem structure. But I would also argue, though, that any change in the color in the ocean, and that's what this is showing, is going to affect the phytoplankton, because that's what they use light in order, they absorb light in order to be able to grow. And so, although things like chlorophyll and primary production are very variable, and we're not going to see trends for possibly another 10 years in our satellite products, the changes to the ecosystem structure is likely to change much sooner, and that's sort of shown in a modeling study here, because anything that changes the fitness between different phytoplankton is going to change the community structure. So if the temperatures raise, then some species that is cooler adapted is going to be outcompeted by something that's warm adapted. If the PCO2 changes, something that does better under higher PCO2 is going to do better, and that's going to lead to significant changes in community structure. So this the bottom here is just showing the time of emergence of a signal, where the trend is bigger than the interannual variability, and the color is the year. And you can see that for the community structure, in terms of Bray Curtis to the to current day, it's happening much sooner and much more parts of the ocean than something like chlorophyll. And any change to the, so I've been phytoplankton centric, I did warn you about that, but just to sort of finish on the fact that this is going to affect higher trophic levels. So this is another model into comparison study. On the x-axis is different emission scenarios. The different colors are different trophic levels. So the dark green is the phytoplankton biomass change, percentage change by the year 2100. The yellow is the zooplankton, and the blue is the higher trophic levels, in particular up to fish. And while the different models, so there were several different models that were in this intercomparison, while the amount of change that happened was quite varied, all of them suggested this trophic cascade, in that the higher your trophic level is, the more the impact is of this changes. And so I'd like to just end with some sort of perspectives. So given the difficulty of being able to detect trends, given this high variability in the system, there really is the need of the longevity and the intercompatibility of ocean color missions. Because the communities are likely to be changing significantly, we really do need to be able to detect plankton communities from satellite. And so the importance of things, of missions such as PACE, and all the attempts to take hyperspectral data and be able to capture different phytoplankton types. A lot of things are happening below the surface. In fact, probably some of the biggest changes are happening because of the stratification, so the shoaling of where the mixing is happening. And this suggests the real need of being able to monitor deeper into the oceans, the importance of LIDAR and bio, or I think it's actually supposed to be BGC, Argo floats, which are profiling floats, which are sort of looking at backscattering and chlorophyll, and will be able to tell us something about trends. We really do need to know something more about these multiple stresses. So the fact that there are these many things happening all at once since I'm a phytoplankton, but to any species in the ocean, they're getting less nutrients, they're getting less substrate to utilize. It's getting warmer, the pH is changing. All of these things are happening at once, and so there really needs to be studies that will detect multiple stresses all at the same time on organisms. And I wouldn't be self-serving if I didn't bring up modeling, so because I'm a modeler, if you hadn't guessed. There is need to include to improvement in modeling. In particular, the IPCC model projections do not include the effect of ocean acidification. And it's because we don't really know enough, but it's also quite striking, quite distressing, because it could be a very important impact. And there is a need for a stronger integration between data and models, and so the continued development of data assimilation products. So, thank you.
We have time for a question, follow-up question to Stephanie. Let's see. All right, we're going to keep going, so we get to our fuller discussion at the end. Steve Running, you're up.
Uh-oh. Well, when you invite a white-haired retired guy to come give a talk, you should know you're doomed to a history lesson. But luckily, it can be no more than 12 minutes long, so it shouldn't be too bad. We'll see. I like to use this slide to give the impression of where we were in global science when I started in 1981. This was from Inez Fung's paper, a map of global NPP circa 1983. And I think it just instantly gives you a sense that we had no global data sets. We had no even logic for global algorithms. We had no computers that could process a global data set. We just had nothing. We were starting from ground zero. And of course, then the immortal Compton Tucker came along and looked at a weather satellite and thought, let's just see if it tells us anything about the the land surface. And of course, NDVI was born, cover of Science in 1985. And so from that point, we started having the opportunity to think, how can we actually quantify, in my case, the land biosphere, in a way that's legitimate and actually global. And so we started, of course, with the planning documents for all the EOS sensors. I was on the MODIS planning group. This was in 1986. And we started thinking through literally from scratch of how are we going to do something globally. In my case, how could I do something like photosynthesis on a global scale when my PhD work was with a cuvette was about the size of your fist that I'd put over a couple of leaves. And now I'm going to think globally. So what I first came up with was the idea of let's parse the meteorology as accurately as we can to how it relates to plant growth. And so my primary first effort was to say, okay, I want to evaluate the water limits, the temperature limits, and the radiation limits on plant growth in much the way you got out of your sophomore plant physiology textbook, just the most rudimentary response surfaces to those variables. And yet, when you look at that globally, this is just an example of a boreal forest and an African savanna. And look at how different those are simply from evaluating the day-to-day climatology through the season. I hadn't even done any physiology yet, and I was a plant physiologist by training. So I was ignoring my own background, you might say. And so we ended up with what I think was a very intuitive but insightful look at the global land surface from the point of view of these environmental constraints and how they work on the plant growth and photosynthesis from a really a fairly insightful way. And every pixel of the 120 million pixels that we had to process per day, every pixel had a somewhat subtly different mix. Now, we only did a very simple bit of translation of all the detailed physiology. And I look at nowadays how we're working on plant functional types and solar induced fluorescence and all this higher order physiology in a way. Well, back then we didn't even dream of anything like that. And so we got out our first global photosynthesis from the third week of June of 2000, and that had never been done before. And it had actually never even been attempted. Nobody even thought to try to do it until I proposed this for the MODIS science team, and here we did it. Now, one of the things that I don't recommend you try in today's world, but I offered my US proposal with no validation at all. I did not have one sentence of validation strategy in my original proposal. Well, how come? Well, what are you going to do about global photosynthesis? And I had no clue what I could possibly do. And the Flux Tower crowd saved my career. I actually gave a history talk to the Ameriflux group 3 weeks ago and got me thinking back to that, of how the mutual benefit of how they saved me in terms of being offer a global scale validation. And it turns out that EOS and MODIS was very pivotal in their justification for their existence at the time. They were struggling to get funding just tower by tower. And when they could overlay their responsibility for EOS validation, that helped them as much as they helped me. And as I look back, boy, it was a marriage made in heaven. And so nowadays there's tons of these papers that compare the the MODIS weekly GPP directly against tower sites all over the world. There's endless papers that do this, but it was hatched back there in the mid to late 1990s, and to me has been just a massive step forward in our ability to do global scale biogeochemistry. And so we even back then contemplate the idea of an organized terrestrial monitoring network that would integrate the US data sets, the tower data sets, other relevant data sets like flash sampling in a big grand monitoring scheme. This is 25 years ago we thought of this. I don't think it has still yet been put into practice in an organized way, even though we now have all the component pieces. And it's a political limitation, not a scientific limitation. And so as I look at what we've done with that NPP data set through time, this was our science paper in 2003. And one of the things that's occurred to me, when you look at the time series of NPP, we've now clearly seen that NPP is gently going up, and the greenness measurements are also gently going up. What I find socioeconomically most important, though, to look at is where it's going down. When it's going up, everybody's happy. But if you have a region that it's going down and after a few years is continuing to go down, that's when everybody needs to start paying attention for that region. And so to my mind, that's maybe the most important part of this data set, society-wise, is when an NPP is going down. Now, this was our science paper in 2010 where we used our algorithm backwards to Jim Tucker's NDVI data set and then forwards in MODIS. And even then, you could see that gently rising NPP that we're continuing to see. But what I found curious, I remember looking at this back in about 08, is how small the interannual variability is at a global scale. It's only about 1 petagram in total, or about 2% of the annual value. I thought, that's puzzling when we think of the variability of all sorts of our biophysical processes. It's way bigger than that. So the Earth system actually is balanced. I guess what it amounts to is when it's a drought one place, it's raining somewhere else to make up for it. And you have that all together, and it's an amazingly stable interannual measurement that I still don't have a real clever interpretation. But it did get me thinking, and this is back when the planetary boundary idea was just bubbling up, and I thought about the global NPP. I wrote a Perspectives for Science at the time that, gee, this NPP kind of seems like one of these planetary boundaries. It's very stable, very measurable, and very societally important. And so what I found now is, as my MODIS career ends along with MODIS ending in the next year, is we have a measurement that has an incredible amount of societal relevance. Just as an example, bioenergy policy. One of my students, Bill Smith, is here. We did a paper in 2012, just kind of a back of the envelope estimate of bioenergy potential based on our measured NPP. These economists were estimating bioenergy that was 10 times bigger than the planet was actually growing. But being economists, they were clueless. And so they were estimating this incredible opportunity for bioenergy. It was like you were growing redwoods on every kilometer of the whole damn world, is what it amounted to. It was just crazy talk, and yet they didn't know better. Well, we in earth science have data sets to show them at least one step of reality, and it was a very good paper. I see in food security policy, another real opportunity. Now, I hope you all realize that we're in the presence of the World Food Prize recipient. You thought that I wasn't going to say anything, didn't you? Just last year. And our NPP analysis is another way we can be tracking the ecosystem productivity worldwide every week. If we start seeing an area that's going down, the food security people want to know about as soon as possible. Another good example of where a data set like this has direct socioeconomic value. Obviously, in climate stabilization, I've seen a number of papers here where we want to know the carbon source sink dynamics of our biosphere and whether we can enhance it. And we certainly want to know if it starts going down. Luckily, at the moment, it appears the land sink is going up, we hope, but this is something that we want to keep an eagle eye on forever because we got to make sure it keeps going up. And so these are the sort of things to do with this global NPP data set, and I'm not going to do any of it because I'm retired. And the end.
Thank you, Steve. Questions on the history lesson? That was great. Really fantastic. And definitely we'll get together on the world food stuff. All right, let's go to Karen Cito, who is going to do land use, land cover, and go all the way to urban areas. The people are coming to town.
All right, well, Steve, you started in 1983. I started in 1960s.
I wasn't even born then.
All right, so land climate interactions. I wanted to go back to 1960 and what the climate models looked like and where land was. And if you look at 1970s, land was represented pretty simplistically, in fact. And it wasn't until just 3-ish decades ago that land cover got a little bit more complex and sophisticated in land cover models. And so Steve and I did not talk about our presentations, but there's incredible parallels because I also have a science plan in mind from the LBA project that many of us in this room are familiar with. And if we look at the early conceptualizations of land and climate, so this is a conceptual framework that was developed from the LBA science plan. Many of you are nodding in the room. I want to highlight that the human dimensions sits outside of the framework of how land interacts with climate. So fast forward to today, our characterization of land systems and climate models has gotten significantly more sophisticated, in large part because of new data sets, some of which that Steve was talking about, but also because of computing power. So we clearly need to have a different framework of how land and climate interact. And if we fast forward to the most recent IPCC report and the special report on climate change and land, one of the key messages of that report is that land management is really central to many aspects of climate change, both mitigation and adaptation. And in fact, the report talks about both managed and unmanaged land systems. So managed from forests and agriculture all the way to factories and cities, how they are critical for local, regional, as well as global climate systems. So we clearly need a different framework for the interactions between land and climate. On the one hand, we know that climate change has a number of impacts on both land cover, but also land use. And this is really critical because a lot of what we're interested in is not only plant physiology, but also how people are actually using the land. And so how people use the land is mediated and moderated by institutions and governance. And so we know there are a number of ways in which climate change is affecting land cover and land use, including reducing crop yields, extending the growing season. And we know that all around the world, many different places have embarked on land-based adaptation strategies, such as restoration of coastal wetlands to absorb storm surges, as just an example. But we also know that both land cover and land use, and again, I really want to emphasize the land use part, has multiple impacts on the climate system. We know that land cover, land use change is both a source of greenhouse gas emissions as well as sinks for carbon emissions. And again, all around the world, we are seeing a number of different land-based strategies for mitigation. So clearly, when we think about climate impacts on land, I would propose, and I think many of us in the LC Luck program would propose, that we need to think about this bidirectional feedback between land cover and land use on climate and climate on land cover and land use. But if we had this particular framework, we would still be missing a critical piece. So let's take this simple view of the food system and its relationship to land and climate. If I use the model, the framework that I just proposed in the earlier slide, we would have this very simple model of food production affecting climate and climate system affecting food production. But we know, in fact, that the food system is much more complex. And here's another nod to Cynthia, because she led this chapter in the special report on land and climate change. So we know that the food system interacts with climate through a number of different channels. It's mediated by a number of drivers that are cultural, that are institutional. There are a number of enabling conditions. And then also what we eat, where we shop, how we eat, what we buy, et cetera. It's also mediated by a number of social factors. And so I want to go back to this framework and argue that instead of this framework, we need this framework. And this is really at the core of the LC Luck program, where we are looking at land cover, land use change as moderated and again mediated by human dimensions, whether these are social institutions or governance. So what I'd like to do in the time remaining is highlight a number of projects from the LC Luck program over the years. So I'll start off with a couple of projects that have focused on how climate change is affecting land cover and land use. And again, I really want to emphasize the importance of the human dimensions here. So I'm going to start off with a project by Dan Slayback, who has been looking at the impact of disappearing tropical Andean glaciers on pastoral agriculture. And what he's done is he has been using Landsat and some commercial satellites, including Maxar and Worldview, to basically look at the changes in Andean peatlands. He says that a number of these peatlands are actually collapsing, they're drying out, and there are a number of different stressors for these. He highlights three, and two of them are clearly climate. So changes in glacier and meltwater volumes. Climate change in terms of causing heavier rain is causing a number of erosion through these peatlands. But he also emphasizes the importance of management and how that is also mediating how climate is affecting these peatlands. And one of the things that he highlights is that in the time that he's worked in these systems, about half of the bofedals have, he says, literally have fallen apart because of the impacts of climate. But again, he really emphasizes the role of management and land management in mediating how climate impacts these systems. Another example I'd like to highlight is work of Jane Southworth from University of Florida. Her project was understanding and predicting the impact of climate variability and climate change on land use and land cover change via socioeconomic institutions in Southern Africa. That's quite a mouthful. However, her primary hypothesis in this project was that climate doesn't just impact land use in Africa, it mediates again through institutions, and that she thought that the outcomes of these institutional adaptations to climate change would actually be visible using Landsat data. So in her project, she looked at Botswana and Namibia. You can see her sites here. And I think one thing that you'll see across all of these case studies is linking satellite observations with intensive field work, whether they're household surveys or ground observations. So one of her key findings in this project is confirming her hypothesis of the importance of institution factors, especially in siting protected areas and how protected areas are managed and how the vegetation is actually affected by climate change. So I will switch to a couple of other projects that look at the effects of land cover and land use change on climate change. I'll start off with a project by Hanting Tian, who is, I think, somewhere in the audience. And he's had a couple of projects where he has quantified global nitrous oxide, both sources and sinks. And interestingly enough, you can see this in this figure that clearly, even though N2O reductions have declined over the last 50-ish years, there's been significant increases from crops and pastures. And if you look at the work that he's done around the world by different regions, you can see that clearly institutions and governance matters, because if you look at, for example, Europe, East Asia or South Asia, you can see the significant increases in N2O sources due to agriculture. So again, these are agricultural land use practices. And this is from a more recent paper where he has shown that the total anthropogenic nitrogen inputs to the global terrestrial ecosystem has increased nearly tenfold during this period from 1860s to about 2010. And again, highlighting the importance of land use and institutions. Another example is the work of Song Nim from JPL, where he's looking at 3D urbanization and how that affects a local climate. He has a project in Haiphong in northern Vietnam, where he has used data to look at three-dimensional urban growth and looked at how three-dimensional urban growth is shaping and changing pollutants in the immediate region. So this is an area that he's been looking at, and from field work, he can see that this is primarily due to the development of power plants and also vertical urban development in the region. And then I'd like to end with this example. This is work done from my group, my PhD student, Kaneng Huang, who's now at New York University in Shanghai, where he has forecasted large-scale urban expansion out to 2050 at the pixel scale. And one of the key points of his work was to look at how urban expansion in the future would affect both local and regional climate. And he finds that future urban expansion through 2050 could increase daytime temperatures up to 5.6 degrees C, which is clearly much higher than greenhouse gas-induced warming. So one of the things that Ken has done in his work is developed a framework for understanding how urbanization can lead to both greenhouse gas emissions through urban activities, but also how urban land use through changes in albedo and also changes in the water cycle can lead to not only the urban heat island effect, but also a precipitation effect as well. So one of the things that he's found in his work is that in some parts of the world, urban land use induced warming may in fact be greater or nearly as great as greenhouse gas induced warming. So in this slide, I don't know if you can see the dotted line. On the y-axis, it is a ratio of urban expansion induced warming versus a greenhouse gas induced warming. And so the dotted line shows where urban expansion induced warming is at least 25% of greenhouse gas induced warming. So you can see there are a number of different countries where GDP per capita is below the global average. These countries here have future urban expansion-induced warming, which is pretty significant. And this basically shows that land use and planning around how urban development occurs over the next 20 to 30 years will have a significant impact on local climates. So I'll end with just this slide. This is from the most recent IPCC report. The AR5 had a heavy focus on urban areas. Each of the 3 working groups developed a fact sheet on urban areas and its linkages to climate. And for AR7, there will be a special report on cities and climate change. So there are many knowledge gaps to be filled. And I'll end with this figure of our program that's been around for about 25 years and highlight our leaders in the group. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And now we have Walter, who is going to be speaking on tracking global biodiversity dynamics in a rapidly changing world. Hi.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And great to be back. How do I operate? Here we go. So last December was a really important moment for biodiversity conservation. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted in Montreal after some delay. And it's, I would argue, not the strongest convention. We all know that the climate convention is much stronger, has more business and political adoption. But it was a watershed moment in that the presence of actors at that meeting, industry, agencies across the board, representatives from the climate side, it was really everybody in the room felt, and already in the process up to it, that something special was happening. And the targets that came out of it were on the ambitious end, what everybody was expecting. Why I particularly think it was a watershed moment is because of this part, and that's the fact that alongside the larger goals and targets that parties agreed on, the US, by the way, not being a party, but together with the Vatican, alongside the larger goals was that monitoring framework, a real recognition that you can't and shouldn't have goals and targets specified without also thinking about their measurement. And that's what this monitoring framework does. And I encourage you all that are interested in this space broadly to have a look at some of these documents. So for goal A, we have this language in the overarching framework. And it's under this larger goal and ambition, it's the 25 vision that's represented in this goal language, that we then have a range of action targets nested. So you would have like the 30 by 30 target that many of you might have heard about is one of those targets. That's an action towards achieving this vision. There is also a climate change target in there. That's very general, I have to admit. But it's in there, and ultimately it's, however, this type of language that does recognize we need to think about ecosystems, about species, and now newly also genetic diversity as important aspects of biodiversity that all need attention, and then importantly, where we need to measure how we're doing overall. And as part of that monitoring framework, then, we had indicators formally adopted. It's a large suite of indicators that then countries are encouraged or expected to report on. And let me tell you about one of those indicators associated with Goal A, and they are specifically, well, it was selected because it's cross-cutting across all 3 major elements there, but it addresses in particular species populations, and genetic diversity, the Species Habitat Index. So this is work that was done under a large coalition of actors with support from many, including NASA, the early parts, and partners such as Esri and Google Earth Engine, with many people involved, researchers, staff who've been really working hard on, for example, developing and then executing on this larger workflow that at the species level is quite complex because there's a whole range of different data sources, data types that you need to bring together, quality control, that we then annotated with new tools that we developed with NASA funding in this case, with remote sensing data to then arrive at predictions, fine-grained predictions of species distributions and all of that at scale for tens of thousands of species. What that then allows you to do is to map out species in great detail and link that information to not just the climatic suitability of 1 kilometer pixels, but also land cover suitability and its change. So this is an important baseline for any change assessment going forward. So we've been using this, others have been using this sort of information to then make projections, what might happen under different land use and climate change scenarios. But importantly, it's that sort of baseline that tells us actually what's where in some detail, and that allows us to then relate to, in this case, for example, land cover change as measured by the sort of products that we heard about from Matt Hansen this morning, as well as others from the remote sensing community. So we're able to look at how is this particular species, the zebra duiker, been experiencing habitat loss over the last 20 years. And additionally, who actually holds responsibility for the species? So that's actually the baseline to begin with. So where does the species occur? Which countries, which agencies are ultimately responsible to look after that species, if you will, for the global community? And you see that the stewardship is very unevenly distributed in the region. And then in red, you see all these places where that species has lost habitat. For now, this is mostly land use change, but more and more, obviously, we're going to see climate change driving that habitat loss. And here in some parts of the range, in particular in Côte d'Ivoire, an immense loss of habitat. Now, we're able to measure that then in terms of area loss, but also in terms of connectivity loss. So we're able to look at the average distance to edge for that species, and that's also been going down quite dramatically. Now, putting that together then allows us to, for that species, for each country, calculate a species habitat score year by year, how much of its original habitat has been losing, or in some cases been gaining as restoration efforts happen. In that, you can then aggregate up across all, in this case, almost 600 species that we've assessed in Ivory Coast, and look at the frequency distribution in terms of species area scores and connectivity scores. The change away from 100 with 2000, the year 2000 as a starting point, here displayed in 2019. And then the average of all of these scores is then the overall indicator trend. So the important thing is here that this is relating to parties of the convention, to a country. This is a metric that countries can use. But more importantly, in this case, it's something that can be related back to patterns on the map, to single species. You can actually transparently take this back to a single species case, and you can use this for decision support. And it democratizes that information for everybody in the region who wants to use it to then assess, okay, well, how does this land use change decision potentially then affecting us in our trajectory towards our 2050 or 2030 ambition? So that's been an important development over the last several years, that we've been able to take some of that basic science and methodology into this arena of indicators and decision support. One specific event that happened here in the US associated with the CBD and that momentum behind the 30 by 30 target is that Biden committed a new initiative, the America the Beautiful initiative. And it's not just about biodiversity. Actually, it's primarily about other things. It's about access, about equity. It's about landscapes. But it has biodiversity very much in there. And what we've been trying to do in supporting some of the key agencies that have been tasked with that, also again in a very, very large collaboration, very much also under the auspices of the GEO Biodiversity Observation Network, is to roll out now that higher resolution evidence base that you'd need as a baseline to then assess change going forward, and as a foundation to then assess, well, as we put all these different factors together that might make this place interesting or that place interesting for additional conservation management activities, doesn't have to be protected areas, of course, could be other management activities. What are the benefits for biodiversity? What are the potential biodiversity outcomes? And what's become possible now through these models at scale, through the high computational power, through remote sensing, is to do this at 1 kilometer scale for thousands of species. And at the global extent, 1 kilometer is a relatively high resolution. We're obviously able to then downscale it further where possible, but it's something that didn't exist before at this spatial resolution, at this extent, for that amount of species groups. So we're not looking just here at terrestrial vertebrates, but also at invertebrates now. All butterflies, all odonates, all ants of North America, north of the Mexican border, included in this. And you see there is quite an amount of difference here. Some parts of the country are popping up for certain species groups, right? And if we were to just look at birds, we'd actually be really missing a lot, in fact, right? So it's important to bring in these other species groups and then feed that into additional planning down the road. So in the final 5 minutes or so of my talk, let me switch gears a little bit. So I've been talking about the global extent, the policy relevance, about these species level models. But I want to emphasize here that we are looking at this at the species level organismal scale, or grain, if you will. And the way the basic methodology we've used here goes back to Grinnell. We ultimately did niche models, right, where you look at species occurrence, you relate that to remote sensing data to then separate the variables that help us understand presence from absence, and then put a prediction on the map. So this was all done at the species scale, if you will. But obviously, and it's useful for coming up with first maps to really get away from the biased in situ observations to then really characterize species distributions at over large extents. But it's missing, and it's good for the baseline, but it's missing then a really true characterization of the adaptations that species, in particular different populations of species, have to certain climatic and environmental conditions. So if you want to think about climate change and how these particular species, their populations are really going to fare under climate change, I would argue we actually need to drill deeper. We need to get away from the scale of species and ultimately take it to the level of populations, and if possible, to the level of the individuals. And we need to think about finer and finer grains of environmental information or remote sensing information that we'd ultimately need to then do these sorts of niche characterization, environmental niche characterizations that we've been using here in what I showed you before at the species scale, to then drill deeper to the population level, because some of the populations within a species might have very different adaptations. They might have very different climatic associations. And again, different individuals within a population might have different patterns compared to the population. So there have been attempts to now use movement data, and you saw the really great presentation by Neil this morning, where it's been showing for wildlife management how much movement data is able to help us here. In order to get to that finer organismal understanding of climatic associations in the context of climate change, movement data can be very, very empowering for mobile organisms. So here, the case of storks, which have been very intensely studied in Europe with GPS tracking. Here, an attempt to link that to high-resolution remote sensing data by a PhD student at Yale, Ben Carlson. And what he's been able to do is to look at single individuals and their space use here on the left side, and then link that over to how then these individuals vary in their individual niches in multivariate environmental niche space, here reduced to two axes. You can think of these as PCAs, essentially a dimensionality reduction here to visualize this. And what we found in these initial populations that we studied in Germany is that these, in this case, 69 individuals for which we characterized niches, that they all were overlapping and ultimately showing a nested configuration. And that's really interesting and important. It's important for understanding the potential effects of then changing environments, changing climates in this place, how that would erode the niches of some individuals more than others in that population, right? And we're just at the beginning here of thinking about this in a climate change context. But today I mostly wanted to show you how we are able to now quantify that sort of stuff at the individual level and at the population level. In this other PhD chapter, Ben was able to expand that assessment to all these different populations across Europe. And we were able to show how different populations show different patterns of this nestedness of individuals in their climatic associations. And it takes us, I think, into a new era where we are able to think about niches at the level of single individuals and across scales of organismal organization. And with that, we can begin to think about this not just in a single species, but on a multi-species context. So as we're able to do that across multiple species, how are these environmental niches, or here we call it Grinnellian factors, so different individuals occupying different parts of niche space, how does that compare as we look at multiple species? How does it change as we go from one community to another? That could be spatially, but or over time as climate is changing. Alongside, obviously, this Eltonian factors or nodes or the food web, you could imagine, for example, would be one expression of this, is changing as well, right? So we need to think about these two things together. But this is sort of a way to try and empirically get at that very complex interplay between behavior, biotic factors of occurrence and co-occurrence, and then the environmental associations that link to climate change. So here it's very exciting to be able to support a project led by Ryan Pavlik, who is here in the audience, I think, called the Internet of Animals project that benefits very much from a work also done by Max Planck, Germany, on using various systems, not anymore the Icarus system on the space station, that was on the wrong part of the space station, the Russian part, now with microsatellites, an attempt to do at scale biological Earth observation with animal sensors, and to ultimately then scale up this sort of thing where you're able to characterize a single individual and its home range for its environmental associations. Here just simply MODIS, we can do that for Landsat as well or for Sentinel, but not just do that up in the corner in Siberia where the home range is of that species, but then all the way along its migration path and down to then the wintering home range that it has in Africa. And just imagine this done at scale over thousands of individuals and hundreds of species. With that sort of vision, I want to leave you and just put in a quick plug for the GeoBond Global Conference on monitoring biodiversity for action that's coming up this fall. Please check out the website. I would love to see contributions from the remote sensing community there. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. Thanks. Fantastic. Okay, our last speaker is Kim Hall on connectivity, climate change adaptation, and conservation decisions. Kim, over to you.
Okay, thanks. First, I just want to thank Woody and Keith for inviting me, and I had to sit up in the front where I could actually see the slides because it's such a great opportunity for somebody, coming from the applied field to be able to just try to absorb all of the amazing information that's being presented at this meeting. So that's where I was. So my title today, as you just heard, Connectivity, Climate Change Adaptation, and Conservation Decisions. And I may have not totally followed the assignment. I'm going to basically try to speak about what I know, which is really kind of the other end of the climate information and delivery. There we go. How about I just hold it? The pipeline that came up in the leadership session this morning, where you've got the data development kind of cycle at the front end and then the actual use at the other end. And I'm sort of coming from that other end and trying to build those bridges back to you all. So I thought I would give you a little bit of a sense of how that pipeline works using connectivity modeling as an example. So as you've heard, both here and through any training that you would have had in ecology and natural history, connectivity is a really critical element of many species' life histories, especially species that use multiple habitats or potentially have a migratory component. It's also really essential for many different processes like pollination and seed dispersal. When we think about climate change, it has some really important added components that can potentially infer benefits to species that are responding to changes in climate drivers. So in a more connected habitat, you would expect the probability that an adaptation that's beneficial that emerges might be able to spread through the population if there is actually some permeability of that landscape and individuals from those different populations can connect with each other. On the other end of the kind of spatial scale, we're also trying to plan for shifts in species ranges. So thinking about entire continents and how might you, again, sustain the permeability of that landscape to try to help species persist. So again, what I said at the beginning, what I'm really trying to convey here is this sense of how does the translation happen? How does all of this amazing data that you all are producing get translated into conservation decisions that are focused on supporting connectivity benefits? And I'm just going to give you a couple examples so you have a little bit of a sense of what the pipeline looks like. Because I think that, by speaking at both ends of the whole pipeline, we can hopefully do a better job of connecting in the middle and improving the science that we're using. How did I get here? I was brought into this community through an ecological applications grant that was originally led by my colleague, Brad McRae, who basically was a real thought leader in the field of connectivity modeling. And he had developed multiple tools, including CircuitScape, which was the one that was the focus of our grant. And over a long-term collaboration with Viral Shah, who's now at Julia Computing, had basically run into many, many constraints in terms of trying to model connectivity, which is, as you might imagine, a cumulative process where you're trying to capture all of these different interactions on a landscape. It's very computationally intensive. And as Brad was working in conservation and trying to look at larger landscapes and take advantage of the amazing high-resolution data sets that folks like you all are producing, basically all the models would crash because they couldn't handle all of those pixels. And so he wrote a grant that was funded to basically update the software that built into a pipeline that TNC was already engaged in to basically create our version of a biodiversity protection map for the US. And I'll show you that in a minute. But first, I just want to back up really briefly and sort of describe the very kind of narrow slice of connectivity science that I'm going to talk to you about today. I'm going to focus specifically on what we call structural connectivity, which is a measure of habitat permeability based on the physical features and arrangements of habitat patches, disturbances, and other landscape elements presumed to be important for organisms to move through their environment. That presumed part is really important because, especially in a large land trust, which is basically what TNC is, although we've expanded broadly, we are really looking at the land. We can manage the land, we can restore the land, we can help get land protected. We're typically not managing the actual animals that are moving. And so we really emphasize the structure and when we think about what we do in terms of the decisions we make and where we invest. So the pieces that I want to just emphasize in case you need to take a nap for the rest of this is that these choices that people that are basically translating your Earth observation data to connectivity maps and conservation priority maps, all those choices that people are making in this translation step can really strongly influence the outputs that they get and the priorities that we then are trying to implement. And it's pretty rare for conservation practitioners to, have enough background in this to look at the hundreds of different maps that are available and say, oh, this one's different for that reason. And so if you can help with that process, especially if you're working with grad students or partnering with NGOs, that's really helpful. Second, climate connectivity is a kind of emerging field in the connectivity sciences landscape. And in a lot of cases, what that's doing is implementing, projections for where habitats are going to move and how do you get a corridor that connects those two pieces. It's super exciting, really cool. I would say there's also a huge opportunity to data mine the changes that have already occurred more effectively and understand how species are responding to disturbances and the loss of land cover, natural land cover that's happened. And now that these models are a lot faster and easier to use, I think that's an amazing opportunity for collaboration among, again, practitioners and you all. And finally, the last piece, just to help support climate change adaptation, which is basically millions and millions of individual decisions, on the ground. People need to have access to this information and understand it. And so that's kind of why this talk is organized the way it is. So just a little bit of background, many of the connectivity models that are out there translate your Earth observations data into what's called a resistance surface. So this is they're making some kind of choice, some kind of model that says, this is how the landscape influences how this critter moves or how this process works. And so in a review that I did a couple of years ago, looking at about 600 papers using connectivity models, it's kind of amazing the diversity of different EOs that have been incorporated, everything from soil moisture to topography to land use, land change. And if you can think about how to map it, someone has probably tried to do a connectivity model with it. I'm going to just show you really quickly the difference between two really commonly applied connectivity models. And using this resistance surface as the background, that's what's shown in the map. Everything that's white on here is low resistance, so easy to move through. Everything that's dark is either a complete barrier or high resistance. And then if you're sitting close enough, you can see tiny little green dots in some of those white patches that with these tools are basically representing the sources that are being connected in the model. So now that I've changed the colors, the green lines represent what's called a least cost path, which is basically the path of least resistance connecting all of those pairs of individual dots. And this has kind of been the most commonly applied method for doing connectivity modeling, I guess, beyond what many conservation practitioners do, which is take a land cover map and draw circles with magic markers. This is kind of the next thing that has been commonly applied. And as you can see, you get these linear features, again, they're the green lines. They're fairly straightforward in terms of quantifying length, quantifying potential improvements. For example, if you can do a restoration, you can straighten that line out. But they give you a very narrow perspective in terms of where those movement pathways may occur. And one of Brad McRae's major innovations in this field was to apply the mathematics of electrical circuit theory to this same landscape and say, how might current flow through those pathways of resistance, and how do you start to see redundancy in the landscape in terms of where you might invest and where you might protect movement potential? And so that's where we'll go from here. In terms of application and working with stakeholders and trying to get people to take action on these maps, the next big step is actually helping them understand the maps. So we do a lot of work trying to quantify that surface that you just saw that was so many different colors of how much current flow would you expect and how is it distributed on the landscape. And so what's happening in this illustration is that you've got current flowing across again, a resistance grid, and you'll see at the beginning it flows out and kind of into this broad purple pathway that's in a low resistance area. We typically call that a diffuse flow area. That's a place where species have lots and lots of options. As it moves into that higher resistance area, and this could actually be, a topographic resistance, but it could also be, maybe that's a dry area and you're talking about amphibians, so it's resistance from a different source. You have these constrained areas, and that's a place where, restoration might be more useful. You're basically helping people wrap their head around the complexity of these outputs. The main focal product for the NESA grant that we had funded several years ago was TNC's Resilient and Connected Network. And I don't have time to talk about this in detail, but I think a real innovation of this product is that it really elevated the importance of connectivity in that rather than first identifying the biodiversity priorities and then trying to figure out how to connect them later, it really seeks to find high biodiversity areas that are in connected landscapes. So you don't have to do a two-step process of trying to reconnect things that are not connected. And I mentioned before that, practitioners and folks that are just looking through the connectivity literature will find many different maps that might show them very different things. And I just want to show you that one with a map that is at the same scale of the one I just showed you. This is work by Belote et al., and it focused on connecting the protected areas in the US using a least cost path approach. And I mean, the first thing, if you've never actually looked at a map of our protected areas, they are not very evenly distributed. And so if you're at an organization like TNC where we're trying to empower state chapters in every state to think about connectivity, when you get a map that looks like this, where you're really only connecting those protected areas, you have lots of folks in Texas and the Midwest and the Great Plains. They're like, what do we do with that? So, thinking about how to operationalize these decisions and find maps that sort of suit the problem that people are trying to solve is really our approach to doing this work in an applied setting. So this is one of the maps that went into that TNC Resilient and Connected Network map. You'll see that still we do, show that there's much less connectivity in the Midwest and the Great Plains. But by first relaxing the constraint of having to connect a particular patch, like a protected area, and connecting everything to everything, you'll see there are a lot more options in terms of where we still have connectivity value. And you'll also basically have some places to work in the rest of the country. Coming back to the idea that you guys are working to create higher resolution, more time steps. That again has been just a major constraint. And this is an illustration of how in the past that constraint was really limiting, again, where people could work. I know it's hard to see on these images, but this is a little inset of Illinois and Indiana, again, so not a lot of natural area left in terms of supporting connectivity, but those places where you have the least left are probably some of the most important places to work. And what was happening is a lot of people in this field were having to coarsen their data to allow the models to run, which in a lot of cases was kind of eliminating any ability to detect any corridors in that landscape. And so this is just illustrating that by showing you what that same landscape looked like with 900 meter pixels on the left and 180 meter pixels on the right. And just any step up in the size, the number of pixels in your landscape has just a massive impact on the number of calculations that are happening in the tool. Okay, so I mentioned the idea of thinking about climate connectivity. This is one example with a least cost path on the left where least cost paths are drawn between current and future ranges. The one on the right is wall-to-wall kind of circuitscape where we're basically prioritizing places that show the highest gradient. I also mentioned the idea of using current variation in landscapes to really understand how the dynamics of connectivity change over time. And this was one of my favorites from the review that I mentioned, where it's looking at the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia under dry, average, and wet conditions, and just showing you how that network changes, just as flooding changes how much land you've got in the landscape. And I will stop right here at this last one, even though I've got some other cool examples that I'd love to talk about later. But just being able to utilize how rapidly data are coming out and think about connectivity in a more emergent and kind of exploratory way. So this is an example that we played with the Oregon fires from 2020, using VIIRS data to just say, okay, let's assume that whatever those fires did, it took out the connectivity from that landscape. Let's see what happens. And we could just keep looking at that as all these fires continue to emerge. All right, thanks. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Kim. I heard three themes. I'm going to summarize very quickly, and then I'm going to ask all the panelists to respond with a 30-second response to the question. So get ready. I think, this is the kind of thing we give our students now, right? Like the elevator pitches and things like that. So what I heard was, across these fantastic talks, and thank you to all the panelists, first of all, really the advancing use and terrific advances in the NASA technologies, the missions, and the models. Most speakers were right, this linkage between not just the missions, but the analysis and utilization of the mission products with models. So that is the first. And towards climate impacts. This is great, advancing towards those societal benefits. Also, many of the speakers linked to the global conventions we have climate, we have the biodiversity, the CBD, so that this work clearly demonstrated, the panelists clearly demonstrated how relevant this work is for decision-making at the global scale, but then also hearing from Kim, also right down at the local scale as well. So this telescoping, I call it the telescoping scales of relevance of the use. The third thing, not theme, but what I picked up was many of the, I think, talks highlighted a potential warning light for the data that you're looking at. So, there's a lot of like, oh, it's so great, it's so positive, but really, like Steve was saying, hey, well, we have to keep an eye on that NPP trend. Karen, that 3D urbanization with the higher temperatures, more than climate change. This is huge, right? And then the potential for the disruption and the connectivity, and I think there was linkage also between what Walter and Kim are doing. And then, of course, Stephanie, with the oceans, you're keeping track of what's really while you're trying to figure it out with the models not agreeing, but, with this color changing, but, what are these really meaning and in regard to warning lights for the planetary systems? Steve mentioned the planetary boundaries. So I think all of this, the talks really came together in that regard too. We've got to keep looking for those planetary warning lights. And clearly the NASA tools and programs are just so really important in this regard. And this linkage, I think we're doing much better to link to, I work a lot on the global as well as the regional, but much better linkage to the global conventions and treaties. Okay, so here's the question, 30 seconds, because Karen has to run back to the Academies of Science. Okay, so as Karen mentioned, the 7th cycle of the IPCC is getting going. It's going to be starting in July, believe it or not. So we have a whole another 7 or 8 years to do work. It's just at the beginning. So actually what we do in our group is we get together and it's like, okay, what is it that we want to do? Because it takes about 7 years to actually get the work, right? Do the work, get it published, and get it into the assessments. But here's the question. What research directions should NASA be pursuing in your science area that will advance towards societal benefits and relevance as we head into the IPCC AR7, the 7th cycle? All right, so who wants to go first? We're going to do handheld. Karen.
Okay, I'm not going to talk about land cover. I'm just going to talk about urban. And I have 3 things that I think we should be doing here at NASA. So one is, imagine if we were mapping land cover and it was just flat. We had no 3-dimensional information about forest canopy cover, or composition or structure. That's basically how we think about urban areas now. We map them as flat, but we know that urban areas are not. So we absolutely need to, and it goes beyond just mapping in the 3rd dimension. We actually need to understand urban structure and function. So it's not just about heights of buildings, for example. So that's one thing. The second is, everyone in this room knows about the Keeling curve. We know about photosynthesis, respiration. There are diurnal activities and diurnal changes in cities and urban areas as well, daytime, nighttime. Where people are during the day is very different from where they are during the night. So if we think about urban adaptation of climate change, we have to think about where people are at night. The other thing is that urban soils and urban forests actually have very different function than forests and soils out in wilderness. So we have to have a better understanding there. And then the third area I would say is on forecasting. My group, we developed the first ever wall-to-wall global forecast of urbanization, urban land cover change. That was 11 years ago. We need to do much more. That was a super clunky model. We need to understand how urban land cover may change in structure, function, 3-dimension, et cetera. So those are my 3 big wishes. Thank you.
And if you need to go, I'm going to Like, Steve, okay, bring your history up.
And up into the future. When I try to think forward, and particularly in the IPCC environment, I was on the AR4 in 2007, so it's been a while. But I recognize that the IPCC authors have to be able to look at published research. And I think of the NASA planning, which I've been in part of at varying levels, and so much of it is towards new missions that aren't going to launch for another decade or more. And it's good I'm retired so I can blurt this out and maybe I wouldn't have before, but I wonder if a little more of NASA's budget needs to be going for what they used to call applied science and not maybe quite as much towards all the new mission development. And I'm probably ruining what it is left of my career by saying this, but I've watched the NASA budgeting forever, and applied science was always the poor cousin that never got much funding. And in today's world, I'm not so sure that's the best prioritization.
Great. Thank you, Steve. No, I agree. I think the societal benefits, the balancing between the basic and the applied, I think that's happening and beginning to happen and needs to happen more as the calls for NASA societal benefit those are ever growing. All right, ready?
All right, I'll try and be quick. So I second what Karen said about vegetation structure, like so important. Obviously, I talked about habitats. So JEDI has been eye-opening. Follow-ups in some form will be key. Second, as I was alluding to get better at the biological processes and the scientific foundations of what ultimately might be happening and our ability to predict that, we do need to ultimately go to finer and finer spatial resolutions that are individual organismal grains of the microclimate, the microhabitat. And there, I think for NASA, partnerships with some of the commercial developments that are happening and thinking about, okay, what could NASA add or complement or should now do in complement to what's already happening out there to ultimately get to the best combined package. Third, in the CBD context, it was really amazing to see, some of the, maybe not even the monitoring framework would have been there in this form, and certainly many of the indicators wouldn't be there in this form if it hadn't been for NASA being pioneering and still very much and expected to be the standard bearer of global products, sort of Earth, like whole near global Earth orbiting satellite products. And so they are the enabler of allowing us to measure stuff in the same way over here on this side of the planet as well as on that side of the planet. Otherwise, you can't have that sort of measurement that's key to actually then measure progress towards these goals. So MODIS was a game changer in that regard for what we're able to do now, and that is so essential going forward. And then finally, maybe something more experimental or risk-taking, thinking, going beyond satellites or even planes as the places where you hook your sensor in, and thinking about maybe even animals as sensors of the environment and additional ways to not just think about animals as things we study, but as ones that actually contribute to the monitoring of the planet. We already see that in the oceans, of course, but I think there's much more potential for this in the land.
Science, like there's citizen science, and they're suggesting animals.
All right, that's a tough question because I would start off by saying what we really need to know is something more about deeper in the ocean below the surface. But I guess you're not going to be able to get a LiDAR mission out in 7 years, and you put 7 years on that. So, and also I think being able to have synergistic effects of different stresses on organisms is really important, but that's maybe not NASA's role. So I have to kind of, so I think if it had to be within 7 years, what can we do with what we have? With pace going up, If phytoplankton functional types from space, I think will be one key thing. Another is there is a huge amount of data that we already have. You know, we keep saying we need more data, but actually there is an incredible amount. And what's difficult is actually merging it, is bringing sort of omics together with satellite data, with models, with other optical in situ instruments. And so I think actually if it was, what we need to do in the next 7 years, the IPC is actually being able to merge those, bring communities together who have expertise in different methods, and trying to actually make more of what we actually have already.
Radical collaboration. It's tough, but we need to do it. Kim, last word, right on the.
Yeah, basically, I just want to kind of echo that same idea just with an example. So last week I was in Southeast Oregon working with a group of ranchers and National Wildlife Refuge folks under a project funded by NOAA to help them do a better job responding to drought. And this is a super variable environment and also a place where remote sensing, we were using Landsat, a 30-year time series of how the water on the landscape has changed. And it was amazing to me listening to these folks talk about their history in that landscape, notebooks from their grandparents and great-grandparents in the late 1800s about how they managed flood irrigation in that system to be able to keep cows alive, and they're still doing the same thing, in the same family 100 years later, and we're not connecting the data to the people, to the decisions, and learning from them in the way that we could.
All right. I have a note from the organizers. We're at time. Please ask people to reconvene at 3:30 p.m. Thanks, everybody. Thank you to the panelists.
right. Let's get started. I am introducing you. And just so you know, if you may want to remind, there's a clock back there. Everybody boldly ignores it. So, but that's 12 minutes. Okay. All right. We are down to our last session of the day. This is session number 3. It is going to focus on disturbance, resilient mitigation, and adaptation. And we have the best person I think we could have picked to direct and moderate this session, which is Shayna McLean. Shayna is our current director for the disasters program. But Shayna really brings a wealth of knowledge and information related to resilience. Her PhD was in environmental science and policy, and her doctoral research specifically examined the challenges of climate change adaptation and disaster response. She's worked all over the place, and most importantly, she's done a lot of work with the United Nations, specifically looking at environmental and climate integration and resilience. So I think we have a phenomenal lineup of speakers. So I think it's going to be a great close for our first day of the Chilean Science Workshop. So without anything further, Shayna, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Is that okay for you?
I think so. Plus, I'm kind of a loudspeaker,
Okay.
so I'm going to have to whisper. Hi, everyone. My name is Shayna McLean. As Laura just mentioned, I'm a little loud, so I'm just going to distance myself from the microphone. Oh, is it? Okay, well, then I will bring it closer than I would like normally. Anyways, as Laura mentioned, I'm the disaster program manager, but for NASA's Applied Sciences program. But today, in particular, I'm very excited for our panel because we get to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is resilience. And so for today, we've got an amazing panel with really interesting and dynamic speakers and content. And so I think it sounds to me like the different sessions have been run differently throughout the day. The goal here is I'm going to introduce each of the speakers and what they're going to present on. We'll go through each one of them, save questions to the end, and then we're going to have them all at your disposal to answer any of your deep questions about resilience and what the future holds in terms of this sphere. So with that, I'll just start by saying, just to ground all of you, we're talking right now about disturbance, resilience, mitigation, and adaptation. I think the way that the session is described is talking about the disturbance and stressors of ecosystems and how they return, to a state where they're still provisioning in the ways that we expect them to. However, I think one of the interesting elements about resilience is that it was long held that we should return to a steady state. And with climate change, we're learning that there are so many dynamic changes happening that there is no such thing as a steady state anymore. And so being able to hear from the speakers and their perspectives in the sphere about how to work in a changing climate with changes in our provisioning services and what we can expect from the ecosystem, I think it's going to be a dynamic session for all of us. So we're joined by Maria Kavanaugh from Oregon State University, who will be presenting on marine biodiversity, ecosystem function, and ecosystem services, understanding adaptation to change. Scott Getz from Northern Arizona University will be talking about Northern American boreal forests becoming more or less resilient to climate change and what this means in terms of disturbance. We have David Skoll. So sorry. No one pronounces my name right ever, which is like a sensitive subject. Anyways, David Skoll from Michigan State University will be talking about more carbon growing in trees outside of forests. Adam Wilson from the University at Buffalo is speaking about biodiversity dynamics and ecosystem resilience. Kyle Horton from Colorado State University, reshaping avian migration in the Anthropocene. And finally, Scott Kanaki from Morgan State University, who will be speaking on using coupled ecological economic models. So enough hearing from me. Let's turn it over to our speakers. I'm just going to call them out in order that they're listed in this session. It's not very exciting, but it's, it tells us where we're headed directionally. So Maria, over to you. And every speaker has 12 minutes. I may do something to remind you at the 1 minute mark. Yes, please.
Up in the back as well? Okay, how are we doing with sound? Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. The work I'm presenting today is part of NASA GeoBond. It's also part of the U.S. Interagency-sponsored Marine Biodiversity Observation Network, but also contributions from the broader NASA and NOAA communities. So thank you all who contributed in advance for your efforts and grace. So climate change is the single biggest threat to humanity and global ecosystems. Fortunately for us, the ocean is our largest ally. It's responsible for entraining much of the emissions and over 90% of the excess heat. It provides abundant and safe food, medicine, and a wealth of biodiversity and cultural significance for people around the world. Climate, biodiversity, and ecosystem services are intrinsically connected. But historically, we haven't paid as much attention to that intersection in the ocean as we have on land. This is particularly true at the regional scale, where the actions of communities in adaptive management may be more impactful and even long-lasting. I think that can and is changing, and remote sensing and bio-optical approaches are not only useful, but imperative. So what are some of the challenges that we face? Marine biodiversity baselines are generally lacking. They're also based on sparse data. We heard earlier about multiple stressors and they interact spatially, but we actually rarely co-measure the relevant environmental change. We tend to treat these biophysical interactions as static when we know that they are dynamic, non-linear, and non-stationary. Coastal regions are especially challenging because they have high time and space variability, complex optical water masses, as well as adjacency effects, amongst other things. So what are some of the things that we're doing? So as part of MBON, we've engaged in indicator development at local to global scales. At the global scales, we're engaged in things like the geo-led essential biodiversity variables, which capture multiple dimensions of biodiversity and are used as high-level indicators for excuse me, international efforts related to the Convention on Biodiversity and the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Regionally, we can work with our colleagues, for example, at NOAA, including the California Current Integrated Ecosystem Assessment, like I do, and with the state governments and tribes. As an example here, on the figure on the right and in the middle, I'm showing existing oceanographic and biological indicators in a dashboard that is useful for predicting salmon returns in the Pacific Northwest. Our hope is that we can complement these indicators with biodiversity relevant ones and that link community composition to metrics of food quality and/or food safety. All right, so regional managers have to engage in a portfolio of solutions for adaptive management. And one great example of this is from Steph Moore at NOAA's Northwest Fisheries Science Center. You may remember that in 2015, a marine heat wave led to persistent warm water in the Northeast Pacific. It led to lower nutrients and a shift in phytoplankton and community composition. And this included a massive West Coast-wide toxic algal bloom of the diatom Pseudonychia. The toxin made its way through the food web to impact a number of finfish and shellfish fisheries and marine mammals. It shut down the Dungeness crab fishery and razor clam harvest for months and led to the loss of hundreds of millions of dollars. Newspapers described a surge in food bank usage in their local communities, suggesting that the lack of revenue was also leading to food insecurity. So what has changed over the last 8 years? 8 years. The states have identified clear Dungeness crab management zones and have expanded monitoring, enabling more targeted closures. This has especially benefited Oregon. Amendments to fishing regulations, it gives delayed areas more protections and limit distributional impacts, which are adjacent market effects. And then finally, the authorization of evisceration orders keeps fishermen on the water. And this has to do with the fact that most of the toxin is stored in the crab viscera, so removing it removes some of the risk, but it's not without cost to market value.
So in response to this event, our M-bond node in the Pacific Northwest is working towards tuning and developing plankton community composition algorithms, including those that measure size, distribution, and dominant functional type. Shown below is the size class algorithm for the Oregon coast, highlighting, if you can see, in 2015 and 16, the intrusion of small cells onto the shelf during the heat wave. We coupled the spectral data, including IOPs and reflectances, with higher taxonomic resolutions using imaging flow cytometry and environmental DNA. This allows us to ask questions about the contributions of diverse particles to what we retrieve from space. It also gets us a step closer to providing synoptic and dynamic phytoplankton indicators for management that can assist with the prediction of either low-quality forage, but also toxic algal blooms. Our goal is to have a robust conduit of trusted paste products to meaningful actions on the water in the Pacific Northwest. And we'll have a poster on Thursday if you want to learn more. So climate change and marine heat waves can increase conflict. Remote sensing indicators can assist with mapping conflict risk. Off of California, there was a large uptick during 2015 in the incidence of whale entanglements. The upper left figure shows the dynamic seascape state in the Northeast Pacific, with each color representing a unique water mass. And the time series shows the spatial extent of seascapes on the shelf bounded by the NOAA Fisheries Survey domain. Briefly, seascapes are a dynamic classification of multivariate satellite time series that we've developed to delineate unique habitats and conduct comparative analyses. For the landscape ecologists in the room, it's a dynamic twist on the hierarchical patch mosaic model. In the time series, we can see subseasonal to interannual variability in the total area that a seascape occupies. And during 2015, a productive upwelling seascape shrank and a more oligotrophic seascape expanded. When the productive seascape contracted, there was an increase in diversity of forage species with the influx of warm water species, but there was less krill and other forage species such as anchovy. This is habitat compression. So what this means, when the forage habitat shrinks, large predators become more focused in the near shore, leading to conflict and entanglement with the shallow fixed gear fisheries. So Tom Bell, who we contributed this slide based on some recent work looking at the variability in response and recovery to the 2015 heat wave using Kelp Watch. Tom and Kyle Kavanagh mapped giant and bull kelp in space and time using a harmonized intermission Landsat data. The Kelp Watch tool allows us to visualize the spatial and temporal differences in kelp cover across large domain from Oregon to Mexico, with the 2015 heat wave shown in blue. We can then ask ourselves about some of the variability in response and recovery time, and whether it was associated with different species mixtures, populations, retention or dispersal issues, or local ecological interactions. Our third vignette was provided by Gong Liu at NOAA. In June of 2015, using its modeled 4-month coral bleaching outlook product, Coral Reef Watch identified severe coral bleaching heat stress in the main Hawaiian Islands. The outlook predicted that the heat stress in 2015 would be more intense and longer lasting than what happened during the previous year, where widespread heat stress and bleaching was observed. Coral Reef Watch's near real-time satellite products also monitored the same heat stress developing. Following Coral Reef Watch guidance and in advance of predicted severe heat stress, the Hawaii Division of Aquatic Resources responded by collecting samples of rare Hawaiian corals around the island and created an ark for safekeeping to give the state's endemic corals a chance to survive repeated impacts of climate change. As of late 2015, one endemic finger coral could no longer be found alive in its range. It was, however, reintroduced in 2019 successfully, as well as another rare endemic species was reintroduced in 2022. So also in response to Outlook, in May of 2016, the Thailand National Parks Department closed 10 of its most popular coral reef sites to diving and tourism. According to the Director of National Parks, when tourists go diving, they may touch or, of course, or step on the reef, and closing those spots will help the reefs recover. Similar actions were taken in June of 2022 off of Han Mun, off of Vietnam, to protect reefs under impending heat stress from inadvertent actions by divers. Okay, I might be running a little bit behind on time, so I just want to quickly highlight 2 more contributions that are part of the tools that utilize remote sensing to help us understand and adapt to climate change. The first is this contribution by Taylor Shropshire, whose particle distribution models can assist with identifying the trajectories of larval fish under different environmental conditions. And it also shows the power of NASA-based physical circulation models to predict as well as teach. The second contribution is from Alice Duvivier, who is working on polynyas and marine protected areas in Antarctica. So for those of you who don't know, polynyas are areas of open water surrounded by heavier, thicker ice cover. They are areas of high primary production and foraging. And so Alice is working with local NGOs to site new marine protected areas that consider the polynyas and location in the context of climate change. In closing, I just want to add a few thoughts for discussion, and that hopefully we can discuss in the panel session. I'd like us all to think about how we contribute to mechanistic indicators, as well as adaptive management and early warning systems. I'd like to think about how we disentangle disturbance versus secular change. There's a great heat wave paper that just came out by Dylan Amaya et al. That talks about this. But I'd also like to bring up the issue of single versus multiple stressors, because even single stressors can act on multiple time and space scales and lead to unknown indirect ecological effects. I'd like to discuss the strategies we all take with embedding our remote sensing efforts with existing time series. And then I'd also like to talk about some of the power that we could have in terms of our in situ biooptics of deploying concurrent high and low tech in order to facilitate accessibility by diverse partners. And then last, putting my ecologist hat on, I'd like to really discuss, and maybe because I'm the only marine person on the panel, what lessons and methods and theories cross the land-sea divide. And with that, I'd like to thank my contributors, my NBON collaborators, the OSU Seascape Ecology Lab, the team for the NBON in the Northern California Current, and of course, all of our funding agencies, and especially NASA. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Maria. What a phenomenal presentation. I like all the diversity of approaches, methods, and also the scales that we saw across the different vignettes that were provided. So next, we're going to turn over to Scott, who will present.
Thank you. Thanks, folks, for sticking around and coming in from the posters. Erase this a little. I was asked to speak today to the topic of boreal forest resilience, and that's likely because I'm the science lead of NASA's Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment, or ABOVE. And I won't speak much about ABOVE today. As Hank Margolis noted yesterday, ABOVE has its own annual meeting, science team meeting, along with carbon monitoring system and some other projects. So this meeting is not so much about ABOVE, but in the context of boreal forest resilience, that's very much in line with what ABOVE is about. So I won't say a lot about ABOVE, but I have one slide. It's, for those of you who aren't aware, it's a large interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary NASA coordinated field campaign that's taking place in Arctic and Boreal North America over a 10-year period. So it's the latest in the series of these NASA integrated field campaigns. And we are entering our third and final phase of ABOVE, or year 7. And it's been quite productive with over 500 peer-reviewed papers coming out of it from a couple hundred projects, and importantly, also a lot of valuable data sets that are archived to be mined for years going forward. And one of the things you'll notice from this photo is a massive fire, an example of a massive fire that took place in Canada a few years ago. That picture will show up a few times in my presentation just to give you some sense of the importance of fire in this system. It pretty much cuts across all the various aspects of above, including carbon dynamics and vegetation dynamics and permafrost and hydrology and snowscapes and wildlife and so on. And there's a lot of research taking place that has documented the impacts of fire in all those various areas, including this nice graphic that was produced by an artist at Northern Arizona University, highlighting a paper that we had come out in Nature a few years ago about the increasing severity of fire in the domain and the fact that it's burning more severely, but also more frequently, and it's in many cases getting down into burning legacy carbon. In other words, carbon that's in the soil that has escaped previous fire disturbance events. So fire is pretty much a cross-cutting topic. Part of the activities that have taken place, again, as part of above, but with others and colleagues from Canada as well, is compiling the largest ever data on combustion from fires. In other words, what burns during fires, and documenting that at over 1,000 sites across this domain, which is the above domain, Western Canada and Alaska. And again, importantly, these data sets are archived and available for others to mine. But they also have demonstrated just the amount of carbon that's coming out of these systems due to fire, because again, it's not just the vegetation that's burning, it's the soils, and especially organic soils, which are very carbon rich when that ends up in the atmosphere. There's that picture again. Fire is not the only disturbance in the system. It's the big one, but it's one of many. This is a synthesis activity that took place documenting disturbances in the North American Arctic and boreal systems. And those include, again, not just fire, but insect outbreaks, permafrost changes, whether it's rapid or slower thaw, cryoturbation, or thermokarst activity, changes in wetland and surface area of lakes, for example, is another, due to ice wedge degradation and drainage of lakes. But there's also an element of, particularly in Alberta, part of Canada, oil and gas exploration that's quite extensive in terms of fracking activities. So in terms of vegetation and its response to fire in this system, there's been quite a bit of work that has documented what happens to forests after fire and how that depends on the burn severity. So this is the graphic here on the left is showing from a recent paper in Science led by Michelle Mack, the changes in vegetation trajectories post-fire. So the y-axis is the amount of soil organic layer remaining after the fire. The x-axis is the pre-fire soil organic layer carbon. And what you see pretty clearly from that is areas that had high soil organic layer carbon combusted due to fire because of a more severe fire, they tend to come back almost exclusively as deciduous vegetation, where that's the yellow colors in this graph. And then the other areas typically come back as what they were prior to fire. In this system, that's usually like a black spruce forest. So fire creates this shift to a more deciduous cohort, And that, in the case of this data analysis, this is about data collected over about a 15 to 17-year period in Alaska, sites across interior Alaska. And that's showing pretty clearly this shift to deciduous vegetation that persists for some length of time. We also did an analysis based on the Landsat record across all of boreal North America. And that's what's shown in the graphs on the right here. Basically, we're looking at deciduous fractional cover in the sort of yellow color in the top right graph, as well as tree canopy cover. And what we see in the record is you go back in time all the way back to 1950, you see for these areas that were mapped with Landsat in 2000 and again around 2020, this gradual increase post-fire as the tree cover recovers and comes back to its pre-fire levels. And you also see that sort of deciduous component as it changes through time over decades. And then the vertical bars are when a fire, the 2000 periods, when a fire occurs. There you see the quick decline in tree cover. This, again, is integrated over many fires across all of boreal North America. And you see that shift to deciduous cover. But if you think about this in terms of the prior decades, there we see when we do this whole analysis and add up all the numbers that most of these systems are eventually, over this time period, returning to an evergreen conifer vegetation type. And that has important implications in terms of whether we're shifting to a different regime and how long that deciduous cohort or component persists through time post-disturbance. And it also has very large albedo effects, and that's what's shown in the lower graph there, big feedbacks to climate that are comparable in terms of the albedo and radiative forcing effects as the carbon component in terms of the short-term forcings to climate. So that's the story of fire and deciduous replacement of fire and persistence of that, with our indication from the Landsat analysis being that it's pretty much net zero. In other words, it's pretty much returned to where it was pre-fire over most of the domain, as opposed to the analysis focused specifically on interior Alaska over a comparable time period. But even aside from fire and the other disturbances that I mentioned, boreal forest productivity is changing. This is an analysis led by Logan Berner, showing at a pan-boreal scale or extent, changes in productivity as indicated by Landsat vegetation indices. And what we find from this analysis when we look across this entire domain is the areas that are experiencing declines in productivity over the past few decades, 30 plus years of Landsat data, are areas that are primarily more densely forested. And those are the areas that are most prone to drought stress. It's also the areas that generally have greater biomass, often in the southern part of the boreal domain. Conversely, you see most of the greening, shown in green on the graph on the right, in more sparsely vegetated forests. So there is not necessarily ubiquitous greening of the northern hemisphere due to CO2 fertilization and warming. In fact, we see a significant amount of areas that are impacted by drought in particular. Now, a recent paper came out specifically focused on resilience of global forests. This analysis was based on MODIS NDVI data over a comparable time period to most of what I've been talking about so far, about a 20-year period from 2000 to 2020. And that analysis based on temporal autocorrelation of the time series of NDVI over this period suggested as shown in greens on this map, that much of the boreal forest, certainly in North America in this analysis, but also you can see in Eurasia, Western Eurasia in particular, this actually what appears to be an increase in forest resilience analyzed using these MODIS NDVI time series data of NDVI. And there's a statement there at the top of the graph that says these benefits are induced by climate warming and CO2 fertilization, which have outweighed the negative effects in much of the boreal forest, ultimately leading to an increase in forest resilience. And that was a surprise to me. In fact, they didn't actually look at climate warming effects or CO2 fertilization effects. It's really just this analysis of the NDVI record. And as I just spoke to you about these changes in composition with disturbance, fire disturbance in particular, shifting the vegetation composition is wrapped up in this time series analysis. So I would suggest that perhaps what they're seeing is related to warming and CO2 fertilization, but I know for sure that it's impacted by changes in forest composition. So that's, I think, a question that's up for further investigation. And in fact, there have been a couple nice new papers that have done just that, looking at the permanent sample plot data that have been collected across Canada over the past 90 years. This is a paper led by Arden Burrow. It's in press at this point, based on some 26,000 permanent sample plots that are measured repeatedly over time over the last 9 decades. And that's what all the red dots are in the map. Those are all permanent sample plots from provincial forest services that we collected and compiled. And he shows that he's able to use a machine learning model, XGBoost, to reproduce and estimate biomass from these permanent sample plots. And then projecting that forward in time over the next 30 years, what's being shown here is changes in biomass predicted out the next few decades, again, where greens are actually increases in biomass. These are aggregated because we need X number of samples to represent the area well in the models. And the areas that are like the purplish, reddish colors there, where there's actually declines in biomass through time. And not surprisingly, those declines tend to be in the warmer, drier parts of the boreal domain. And again, these are areas that are focused on areas that are not disturbed. If permanent sample plots are disturbed, they're removed from the analysis, in this analysis, but also in this other recent paper that just came out based on permanent sample plot data. Shown here, in this case, it's based on the Canadian National Forest Inventory and some of the US Forest Inventory and Analysis data sets. And that's what all the black dots are in this map. So they did something quite similar to the previous paper. Some 20,000 sites, intentionally excluding sites that were disturbed or experienced high levels of mortality, maybe due to insect disturbance or whatever else, what other kind of disturbance. And when they project forward, they find something quite similar to that previous paper, even though it's based on completely different data sets, somewhat different approaches. You see this changes primarily declining. In this case, they looked at basal area increment. We looked at biomass. This is basal area increment. They're showing declines in these warmer, drier areas in basal area increment, primarily white spruce, which is the sort of gold-colored or yellow-colored wedge in these graphs. And it's primarily in the western, in Alaska, or Western Canada and the drier parts of the domain. So that's pretty robust evidence, I think, of the changes that have taken places. And this is projected out, I think I may have failed to mention, to 2050 using RCP 4.5. Okay, and then finally, a nice new paper and analysis on boreal forest mortality through time, again, based on a lot of permanent sample plot data, fed into a model that is specifically developed to capture tree mortality through time, and also informed with some satellite data records, both Landsat and MODIS. And what they show is something perhaps more in line with what I would have expected initially coming in to look at boreal forest ecosystems through time and the resilience, is this increase in mortality over the past several decades. And interestingly, they show this inflection point around 2002 where mortality increases quite rapidly afterwards, which suggests that perhaps we've crossed some threshold point there. And I know I'm late. This is the last slide. I think it's the last slide. And on the flip side, the same thing with biomass. They're seeing declines in biomass, again, with that inflection point around 2002. So pretty good evidence, I think, from these very, very rich permanent sample plot data sets of what's actually happening, at least in boreal North America, which needs to be reconciled, I would say, better with the satellite record based on the previous example that I showed you, interpreting the changes in NDVI as resilience. So that's that. And then I think I have just a final slide just with summary bullet points, which maybe in the interest of time, I won't read. I'll let you read them. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. I mean, phenomenal talk also. I think it's so interesting when we know ecosystems change, but it's interesting to also think about the dynamism of the change itself, right? Disturbance, no disturbance, mortality, shock, stresses. So, what does resilience look like under these changing approaches? So next, we're going to turn it over to David. And so I'll just turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm a little bit shorter than Scott. I'll pull this down. All right, I want to spend a few minutes of your time talking about new research on measurement and mapping of carbon in trees outside of forests. So most of what I'll talk about is derivative of this piece that we had in Nature Climate Change about a year ago. This was something that I did with my colleague Martin Brandt at the University of Copenhagen and Sheikh Ambo, who is at the Centre de Survie Écologique in Dakar. Martin is a machine learning, big data analysis expert, and Sheikh is a carbon measurement, monitoring, and agroforestry expert. And I'll later talk about the community that is emerging and why we wrote this piece. But the idea is that currently there are billions of dollars of public and private capital being mobilized for interventions and actions for mitigation of carbon emissions in high biomass, closed canopy, mostly tropical forests. And there's good reason for that. That's where some of the biggest gains and benefits would be from the least amount of investments, of course. But there are also some fundamental problems, such as complicated ex-ante projections need to be made for baselines. Complex counterfactuals have to be invoked. And finding the attribution of the success or results of any action or project to a particular intervention is often very, very difficult. On the other hand, trees outside of forests are, although low in carbon density, are ubiquitous across the continent of Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And these are systems that the evidence is showing are actually growing and increasing or sequestering carbon. It's a source of removals. So whereas focused efforts on high biomass forests, with the exception of natural forest regeneration, are mostly focused on avoiding future emissions. Those are future strategies. They don't really do anything about removing what's already in the atmosphere in excess. And this is emerging more and more important as we're looking at specific pathways to avoid the 1.5 degrees centigrade climate threshold that the IPCC is looking at. And so there's ever more interest in removals, and really one of the only strategies for effective removals at scale are trees outside of forest in these sparse woodlands and individual forest areas. Not only that, but these systems are also areas where people live, and many of the communities in these areas, billions of people who live and are dependent on tree-based systems and live in extreme poverty. And so this has the dual benefit of not only mitigation, but also adaptation and other benefits for livelihoods enhancements. So the rationale was based on the fact that we can do this because we're seeing the emergence of the necessary measurement and monitoring tools, principally from Earth observation assets. So this community that I speak of is emerging. Here are 3 major papers that were just published in the last 3 months. There's a lot of stuff happening. On the one hand, on the right, upper right, was an effort that was put forward to map every tree and capture the crown area through machine learning and using VHR data. In this case, digital aerial photographs. The whole country of Rwanda was mapped, demonstrating that this can be done at scale at the national level. Down in the lower left, in the early spring, was this really impressive paper by a great group out of Goddard, a NASA group led by Jim Tucker and his colleagues, in which they mapped 9 billion individual trees across the Sahel using VHR data. And then just a week ago, another paper was released by a team led by Florian Reiner, and it included an international group that was demonstrating how planet data could be used to map the entire continent of Africa. So there are a couple of things that are driving this development of this community. Of course, it's first the availability of new VHR data from orbital satellites in very large quantities. And the second is the development of machine learning capabilities, as well as high-performance computing and new methods in forestry for doing measurements. So in the case, here we see an example of some of the products that are being produced at the national level for carbon mapping. The idea is that machine learning and VHR data can produce polygons, if you will. They can produce outlines of the canopy or the crown, the so-called crown projected area. And through field calibration of models, allometric equations can be developed that are based on the crowns that predict the crown area measurement from space. In this case, you see the continental or subcontinental application that I spoke of, 9.9 billion trees that the Tucker Group has put out, and then the continental scale, Pan-Africa with planet data is looking like this. So the idea here is simply that, not simply, but the idea is that if machine learning tools can produce these data sets of crown projected area polygons, then we can use basic field methods, as shown here, to produce an allometric relationship between true allometric parameters, in this case, a remote sensing derived crown projected area, and DBH, as shown in the lower right. And this can be derived through a standard sampling scheme of sampling plots that can be implemented quite quickly and rapidly and can be integrated within national forest monitoring systems in regions like Africa. And so what we did is a proof of concept like this was published in a recent paper. The methods that are used for carbon assignment. You have the raw imagery on the left, the crown projected area predictions from machine learning algorithms, and then the individual tree assignment of carbon stocks. So now you can get tree by tree carbon stocks and also map it across continental scale landscapes. The improvements are, I think, significant. Here, just quickly showing the comparison in the upper panel of a 50-kilometer transect using the Maxar 0.5 centimeter VHR data and an algorithm that scales allometric scaling from CPA to DBH, and then the application of a standard DBH-based allometric equation from the region. And then the middle panel is the results of Bacchini et al., which is a 5-kilometer resolution global data set on biomass for the same area. And then the 30-meter version of the Bacini data set. And you see a lot of notable differences that we can't talk about now, but one is that you see a much more robust and specific, spatially specific and spatially robust map using the VHR data. In fact, if you zoom in on that and look at the overlay with, say, the global data set, you can see that the global data set attenuates or flattens, tends towards the average of the landscape area, and then does not pick up the individual places of tree planting or tree occurrence. And that's essential for looking at interventions that finance is being leveraged for in carbon sequestration projects. You need to really look at the places where those are happening in order to credit them. And so the basic idea behind this is that there are two approaches to allometry. One is shown here on the left with the blue area. With destructive sampling, you can produce a direct relationship between crown area or crown diameter and biomass. But this requires destructive sampling, which is difficult, expensive, time-consuming, and it needs to be done everywhere that you plan to use the satellite data. On the other hand, there's another approach that's used. The former approach is used. It was based, the approach generally used by Tucker's group. It's completely valid. The other is this indirect approach in which you get the remote sensing data to estimate a standard allometric parameter and then use that parameter, which in this case is dBH, and is widely used by most forest methods to apply a standard off-the-shelf, so to speak, allometric equation, which requires only field work and no destructive sampling. So it's a non-destructive approach. And either one of them can go. And so you can see these relationships between crown area and dBH showing these kind of graphics. And then the application to Rwanda used this approach and produce these kinds of maps for the entire country. And interesting things emerged from this. For instance, 75% of the trees in the country of Rwanda were outside of forests. And this constituted 49% of the carbon stocks. Okay, albeit the forest system still held 51% of the carbon stocks. But 49% was in areas that were previously unrecorded or not brought into the carbon accounting system. So this is really important, and these are in agriculture and rural landscapes where people are using these trees for their livelihoods. We can then, as the last example, show how we can apply this to an intervention project. This is based on the AFR 100's set of projects in Africa right now. And there are 3 of them in Malawi. This is just an example. We'll focus on the bottom one. We can then put in a sampling scheme. A standard sampling scheme is shown on the right of 1 hectare fixed radius circular plots. This is the landscape. You can deploy field teams to collect the basic non-destructive parameters. You can plot these out as maps of plots across the landscape. This shows how the plot can be converted on the left to a product on the right, which is a carbon measurement by individual trees. And then you don't use the plot as a sample plot. You use the plot to calibrate your model to estimate dBH. And then when you apply that model using high-performance computing and large data sets across the whole of the VHR project, the whole of the sequestration project area, you can get maps like this that actually are recorded at the tree level but can be aggregated to other coarser levels. In this case, the total carbon in the project for the baseline is 148,722 metric tons of carbon, only about 3 metric tons of carbon per hectare. The maximum value was 9. This is carbon that is heretofore often not recorded, not used, and is relevant and important to people who live in these areas, and for countries that are heretofore not been included in the dialogue on forests in up to now. And so it offers a lot of potential for intervention, measurement, monitoring, and reporting. I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. What I find interesting is not just the climate mitigation elements and the livelihood enhancement elements that you mentioned, but also, the perspectives on how it could improve elements related to environmental justice as well. So just interesting diversity of approaches there. So now we're going to turn to Adam Wilson. So Adam, over to you. Yeah, you.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to approach this talk a little bit differently. When I was asked to do this, Woody asked me to take a few steps back from my my specific research. And so I'm going to start with a report from the World Economic Forum, which probably many of you have heard of. It's a global gathering, gets together every year, that includes heads of state, heads of institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, heads of companies, large multinational corporations. And one of the things that they do as a part, one activity involved in the World Economic Forum is this global risk report. And so they do this survey and they have this long list of several dozen potential risks to the global GDP, global population. So it's a very anthropocentric, human-focused risk assessment. And they do it on two timescales. They do it on a 2-year timescale and a 10-year timescale. And so hopefully you can read the text on those boxes there. You can see the number one risk at the 2-year time frame is cost of living. So that makes sense, high inflation. A lot of people are struggling with that. If you look at the colors though, so the green ones are environmentally related risks. So number 2 there is natural disasters and extreme weather events. Number 4, failure to mitigate climate change. Number 6, large-scale environmental damage incidents, and so on. And if we go out to the 10-year time frame, just look at the colors. Look how many green squares there are in this top 10 list as ranked by the World Economic Forum. And keep in mind, this is not a survey of like the people in this room. This is not a survey of conservation organizations. These are, heads of state, heads of big companies, people involved in financing major projects around the world. And if you look at those, so several of them are related to climate, failure to mitigate climate change, failure of climate change adaptation. And then number 3 and 4 is very relevant for this group. Natural disasters and extreme weather events. Number 4, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. Number 4 on the 10-year time frame. I find this pretty amazing. They also ask them to look for connections between these various risks. So this is the network map of all of those risks. So here you can see there's not time to go through all of them, but there's several dozen. It was a pretty long list to choose from when they were making this ranking. If we zoom in over here on the right, you can see that all the environmental risks are kind of lumped together and interact with each other. Not surprising. And you can also see how they connected those risks to other kinds of risks. So the big red one in the middle there is natural disasters and extreme weather. You can see on the side there, large-scale involuntary migration. So this is things like crop failure causing people to move from where they are. The blue one at the bottom, collapse of a systemically important supply chain. So when you look at this list, the top 6 here, all green, and then number 5, that involuntary migration was directly connected to the other green ones in that network map. So here you have the top 6 risks as assessed by the World Economic Forum. I found this surprising, right? I found this actually surprising when I looked this up. And you can actually go back in time. They've done this for a number of years, and you can see that the green boxes have been slowly climbing up this list as you go through time. And so when I look at this, I see two high-level things. Thing number 1 is the world is starting to listen, right? So if I was showing the survey of the people in this room, I would not have been surprised by this ranking. I think that all of us probably would put the environmental concerns that we're all faced with pretty high on the list of global concerns. I would not have expected this from the community that goes to the World Economic Forum. And then number 2 here is that they're going to want answers. I think they're going to want them soon, and they're going to look at the people in this room. Right, as several people have mentioned over the course of, especially today, this community represents, I think, many of the world experts on the topic of thinking about how environmental change is, or how the environment is changing through time, right? And NASA in particular has a special role here with its global perspective. But taking that global perspective and nailing it down, figuring out mechanisms that are under the hood, thinking about change through time, variability through time. I think that we should expect a knock on the door, right? Relatively soon. as this community starts to become aware and start looking for questions. Because if you imagine yourself as someone who's attending the World Economic Forum, you're not especially interested in the environment. What you're interested in is, managing the World Bank, managing the finances. You're thinking about how to run your company. You're a CFO at a petroleum company, and you're thinking about decisions that you're making, to plan for the next couple of decades. And so this little animation here probably is familiar, representing two basic concepts in the ideas of resilience. So the top one there is engineering resilience, which is often referred to as how hard you can push a system and have it kind of come back to the same place. So how far does it move when you push it? And then how fast does it recover back to where it was? So that's the ball moving within one of those little cups. And then occasionally, if it's pushed hard enough or that landscape changes, you'll see the surface kind of move a little bit, that little ball rolls into another place. So that represents a major transition. So that would be like the ecosystem collapse due to biodiversity loss. Or it could be something like forest to savanna transition, or a clear lake to a eutrophic lake. There are lots of examples in ecology of alternative stable states and major ecosystem change. Given that I've already used half my time, I'm going to focus on that first example, which is this engineering resilience, which fortunately is also kind of an easier thing to look at. And it's particularly well suited to remote sensing. Right? So we have these long time series of remote sensing. We can look at change through time and think about what caused that change, how far did it change, how quick did it recover. There are a lot of useful metrics that we can pull out of this. And related to this idea for many decades has been this idea of biodiversity and how biodiversity influences this quality of resilience in an ecosystem. And so the basic thinking here, as illustrated by Elton in 1958, is that greater diversity should lead to greater ecosystem stability because there's more sort of options for recovery, right? There's more ways that the ecosystem can respond because there are different species with different characteristics that can respond differently to that impact. And so starting in the 1990s, and most famously at the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve, was the Tillman plot, setting up these biodiversity ecosystem function monitoring, where they had these very, very controlled, randomized replicate trials of grassland biomass or grassland species, and then they monitored all kinds of traits at the ecosystem level and looked at how things like the number of species in a plot influences ecosystem stability through time, or traits, as you can see on the right here, number of species pre-drought affecting drought resistance. So as you get more species in that community, those grasslands tend to be more resilient to changes like drought. And a great summary paper that came out of this group of work here is looking at changes in productivity on the y-axis here as a function of as you remove species. And this is more than just grasslands. This is a big meta-analysis. And so what you can see is that as you remove species from a community, on average across this large meta-analysis, you tend to see a drop in productivity that is of a similar magnitude to many other major ecosystem forcings. Things like carbon dioxide fertilization, warming, acidification, drought, and so on. And so this sort of community of people looking at biodiversity and ecosystem function have shown that biodiversity is an important component of ecosystem functioning and also contributes to that idea of resilience. The challenge, though, is that by necessity, a lot of these ecosystems are very simple. They're simplified, right? They're grassland. They're things that you can easily manipulate. It's much harder to do this at realistic scales, for a tropical forest, for a savanna system. Fortunately, though, at the same time, this community was thinking about biodiversity and ecosystem function. Here at NASA, people were thinking about other things, thinking about building instruments, putting them into space. Thanks to Steve Running for the great overview. I can go through this fairly quickly. But of course, we have this time series, incredibly valuable time series that allows us to go back in time and look at how ecosystems have changed in the past and revisit these time series with this idea of ecosystem resilience. And I'm going to argue revisit it now, thinking about how we can use new sensors to sort of better understand the spatial variability of biological diversity and how that contributes to this idea of ecosystem resilience. And so early on in the process, there was a lot of focus on land use, land cover change. Still today, it's a very important topic. As the time series got longer, and we saw this in Steve Running's talk, looking at trends, positive, negative. Phenology, of course, is an element here. We can look at change within a year. We can look at how that change within a year changes through time, right? And we can also ask questions about ecosystem resilience. So how ecosystems respond to different kinds of perturbations. The most common here is fire, right? So the most obvious, you have a fire. Scott Getz showed some great examples of how you can use long time series of things like Landsat and MODIS to look at how ecosystems respond to different kinds of disturbance. And I've written a couple papers on this kind of thing. But these long time series, these older sensors are relatively crude, right? We're relying on things like NDVI, estimates of NPP. We now have the really exciting development of a whole new class of sensors that are giving us things like three-dimensional structure through JEDI and different kinds of radar. We have imaging spectroscopy that's giving us a much greater in-depth look at maybe not exactly biodiversity, but man, we're getting a lot closer by looking at functional diversity and by looking at functional diversity as it changes through time. I think we can get a much greater and deeper perspective of what's going on the ground. At the same time, we have all kinds of new information coming in from the other direction, right? We have all of the omics, we have citizen science observations, we have field campaigns, and I think above is a great example here of focusing on how we can use both long time series with well, it's not a short campaign, a 10-year campaign of data collection to really dive in and dig into these questions of how ecosystems have changed through time in response to different kinds of perturbations. And so I think taking a step back again and looking at this list, I encourage you to think about this list not as an ecologist or a remote sensor or whatever you consider yourself to be. Look at this list as a CEO of a company, as a head of state, a head of the World Bank or a finance minister at the World Bank, and think about what kinds of questions you would have as that person for the people in this room, right? And maybe not today, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10 years, maybe we have to wait until we start seeing this happen, right? Maybe we have to actually wait until we start seeing ecosystems falling apart, like we have the massive mortality of, was it 3.6 million trees in California this past year, as documented by I believe it was the USGS that did that aerial survey. So as this stuff starts to happen, as we start to see these events play out, I think we're going to see those heads turning towards this very community, right? Asking questions. How many species do we need to maintain in order to avoid ecosystem collapse? How many? Like, can we lose 10? Can we lose 20? I bet most of us, even in a well-studied system like Tillman's grassland pots, well, maybe he could answer that question. He might have an answer. Okay, 18. You have to save at least 18 and we maintain ecosystem function. But in most ecosystems, I'd say we have pretty much no idea, right? And I think that's a problem. So looking forward, this is in a sense a call to action, I guess, to really be thinking about how we can use the information we have and really integrate the long time series that we have of Landsat and MODIS in particular, together with all of these cool new toys and not lose focus on the older stuff, right? This goes back to Steve Running's point around, so much focus, so much money on new toys, which I agree are really cool and I love them. But being able to think about the new data as it comes in this longer context. And really, even 1970, the beginning of the satellite era, is much too short. We need to be looking at longer field records. We need to be going into the deep past with, archaeological and deeper time stuff. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Call to action.
Thank you so much, Adam. It's interesting. I follow the EF Global Risk Report all the time. And I mean, I feel like, we've known these things for quite some time. And so it always ends up as a valuation kind of component, like, how much do you value these things and what's going to incite you to action, right? And so it's not enough to know these things sometimes, but to actually say that we're going to set an agenda around it, right? And so I'm interested to see when we're going to start acting on the risks that we've known for quite some time. But great talk. And I like the call to action. With that, let's turn it over to Kyle. Over to you.
Let's see. Thanks, everyone. Before I jump in, I just want to thank Keith and Woody for the opportunity to share some of this work that we've been jumping into for the last number of years now. And I just want to acknowledge the list of co-authors and universities that have been helping out with this work. Sort of can't do this work without them. So I just wanted to sit back as Keith mentioned, thinking about this topic, reflecting broadly. I pulled up this photo that I took about a year ago. I took this photo last spring in Pawnee National Grassland. It was quite remarkable. I was with a postdoc and a grad student, and I remember the moon had set and the Milky Way popped up, and they said, "That's the first time I've seen the Milky Way." And then I heard the grad student say, "Me too." And it was just sort of this aha moment to share that with them, but then also have some slight sadness that it took them 30 years to see the Milky Way, right? Something that hopefully we all get to experience in our lifetime, but just looking at this photo in a really pristine area, looking at the bottom of this photo, it's blown out with sky glow from distant development as well. So even in a pristine area. We're all familiar with images like this from the VIIRS day-night band. I took this photo here out in Pawnee National Grassland. So in eastern Colorado, a really rural, underdeveloped area, still seeing the creep of sky glow from development. So as we start thinking about how do we quantify light pollution, what's its impact, again, we go back to the sensor that we have access to monitor this in a global setting. So about 6 years ago, a study came out in Science Advances from Chris Kaiba's group looking at what was the change in radiance, light pollution in a global setting. They looked at VIIRS data and they found about a 2.2% increase in brightness per year in nighttime glow. And this was kind of eye-opening, right, to see these numbers popping up. They just did a recent revisit of a similar type of analysis earlier this year. They used a different framework for looking at this. They were using community science observations, asking observers, how many stars could you see at your observation site? They were able to back calculate these trends over time and try to figure out what was the rate of increase in sky glow that would account for this decrease in the number of stars these observers were seeing. They measured something like this, sort of an eye-popping number of the increase that we weren't seeing with a satellite remote sensor here, about 10.4% increase percent per year. They went back to those same locations where those observations were being made, pulled the VIIRS data, and they found this trend in North America. So we objectively know that light pollution is increasing, but it's sometimes not showing up in these sensors. And they sort of reflect on this, that the sensitivity of that sensor does have some limitations, right? So the sensitivity is somewhere in this range here, between 500 and 900 nanometers in the visible light spectrum. As we start shifting our lights to LEDs, they become more efficient. They're also changing in the color of those lights. We're starting to occupy lights and light pollution more in this area here. As we move towards whiter, cooler colored lights, there's a large pump in the blue spectrum here. It's mixed with some warmer tones, but we might be missing this with the sensor. So even though light pollution might be going up, some sensors might be showing a decrease actually. So again, I'm sure there's folks in this room that are thinking about this quite deeply and how to reflect on this, correct for it. But I just wanted to draw attention to sort of a recent study that's pointing this out. So as we were thinking about this last year, we were thinking about what's the impact of light pollution on migratory organisms broadly, not just birds. Can we see what's out in the literature? So to do this, we did sort of a larger review. We published this earlier this year in Trends in Ecology and Evolution. And our first step here was just to pull up the literature that has a keyword of light pollution. And again, this isn't specific to ecology, it's just the general term of light pollution showing up. And I'm sure many of these papers that we found are from this community as well. But in the last 20 years, that's been a rapid increase in publications. We then tried to overlay the Venn diagram of light pollution and migration, animal migration. So the number, you'll notice the y-axis of number of publications is dramatically smaller, fewer number of papers. And I would say in just maybe the last 10 years has there been sort of a rapid uptick of an investigation of light pollution on animal migration. But even still, there's few and far between examples. It's hard to figure out what's the impact while an animal is actively migrating. We dug into the taxonomic breakdown of these papers. Maybe luckily for me, because I study birds, it's pretty bird skewed, but it's a call to action of we need to know what's going on with all these other migratory organisms, and it's not just birds that are presumably being impacted. So I'll just pull up a few examples that we touched upon in this paper. So monarch butterflies, everyone's probably quite familiar with them. This is a diurnal migrant, and I'm talking about migration and light pollution, right? Thinking about nighttime stuff. So it's not just the organisms that migrate at night that are impacted. The exposure of artificial light to monarchs during the night can influence their orientation during the day. We've seen examples where on macro scales, how organisms like grasshoppers are being attracted to cities. It's not just a few grasshoppers that are showing up in Las Vegas. There are news reports. We're able to quantify this. 45 million grasshoppers moving into Las Vegas, with probably the central driver being light pollution attracting to these grasshoppers at night. And I'll talk about this in a little bit, but these observations of these movements actually showing up on radar as well. We can think about how light pollution can start fragmenting landscapes, right? We think about roadways maybe fragmenting a forested landscape in the sense of maybe a salamander can't cross the road or a mammal can't cross the road. But we can think about light pollution starting to fragment airspaces where some bats are preferentially avoiding illuminated areas. Sometimes they're going to them to forage on insects, but sometimes avoiding them and reducing connectivity of airspaces. One of the, I would say, quintessential examples that we've worked on is the attraction of migratory birds to this focal light source in lower Manhattan, the September 11th tribute in light. When those lights go on, we see migratory birds flocking to it like a near magnetic draw. Across years, we're seeing millions of birds being attracted to this light source. So a really direct example of the impact of light on migratory organisms. We've also looked at how do we mitigate this issue as well, right? So if you're at AGU and you went to McCormick Place Convention Center, we did a study there a couple of years ago. And what we found is that having the lights on the convention center can reduce bird mortalities at that site by 6 to 11 times by just having the lights of how many birds are colliding with the building. So it sometimes is as easy as turning the lights off, but it's a big human problem that we have to face of dealing with policy and convergence research. It's not just as easy as flipping off the switch. So we wanted to think about, we have these examples at various scales across various taxa. Thinking about the tools that we've had in my lab, we wanted to ask this question is, does light pollution impact migrants at a continental scale? Can we actually see shifts at the broadest scales that we can document avian migration? So we can think about migration like this, right? Birds are migrating at night. They settle into the landscape during the day. Maybe you can't hear me that whole time. I hope that wasn't the case, but here we go. So the migrants might settle into a forested landscape, an urban landscape. And as the sun sets, they take off. They come up into the airspace. And when I reference radar, these are weather surveillance radars, so ground-based radars scanning the airspace every 5 and 10 minutes. And we can see where those migrants are taking off of the landscape. So what does this look like in practice? So this is a snapshot of radar imagery that I pulled. This is exactly from a year ago from this area. This is the local radar for College Park, Maryland. And what you're going to see is the sun's going to set and the birds are going to take off and they're going to start flying north on their spring migration. So we've got tons of birds moving up into the airspace, many species. Again, on this order of magnitude, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of birds moving through the airspaces. So we can take these not just from one night, for instance, but we can take it across many nights. We can remove clutter, precipitation. We can start overlaying these for many nights, for seasons and years, assemble those and start to understand what is the landscape of where the birds are taking off from terrestrial landscapes. So we've done this for many sites across the US. So this one's for Oklahoma City. We've done this across all of the radars for the lower 48 states. And then we move into this phase of think about this like a niche modeling exercise at this stage, right? Can we link things like land cover and EVI, precipitation, temperature, and namely things like sky glow? And how do those drive the distribution of migrants on the landscape? So that's exactly what we've done here. So we've layered into these predictors. We use 49 predictors in this large model. And then we can start assessing what are the positive or negative predictors of migration density. So our modeling framework is such that we use something like an XGBoost gradient boosted machine learning model. We do this across the US. We assemble many different models to gather insights. So in total, we use around 2,500 models that get assembled here. This helps us from a number of statistical things that you'll see in just a second, where we can get trends coming out of a machine learning model, which classically is a limitation. And then what we can get is a prediction of where the birds are taking off of the landscape. So this alone is a great product for us. From a conservation standpoint, we can deliver this to managers, to conservationists, so they can know within their regulations where are the birds on the landscape at a state level, at a federal level. But we want to go further into these data. What is driving some of the heterogeneity that we would see? So we make these predictions at a 3-kilometer scale. We can see some hints of what's going on here already. Higher abundances, the warmer colors here in riparian corridors and forested areas, negative associations, if you're familiar with this area, from agricultural lands. And what we're able to do is try to figure out what's the top 10 predictors of migration stopover across the US. So really quick, you're going to see 3 colors. You're going to see blue being a positive predictor, red being a negative predictor, and gray being a neutral predictor. So grassland herbaceous cover here across the US, some areas it might be positive, and some areas it might be negative, but overall it's sort of neutral at the US scale. Mixed forest, maybe to no surprise, is a strong positive predictor. We can go through the next series of predictors. We see cultivated crops being a strong negative predictor at the US scale. And then I'll just draw your attention to this top metric up here. So our number 2 predictor here being sky glow, showing a really strong positive predictor of stopover density at the US scale. So this is quite alarming to us. We want to see, is this unique to spring? We pulled up fall data. We get the same pattern, sky glow showing up as the number 2 predictor. It's actually even stronger in the fall than it is in the spring. We broke this just down by metrics, just so sort of we're clear. Land cover is still a dominant predictor of where birds are on the landscape, both from the pros and cons, right? Positive and negative predictors. But nonetheless, sky glow is really quite jarring here. So just some general takeaways of things we're trying to wrangle with. It appears that urban centers are showing hints or traits of something like an ecological trap. They're preferentially moving into urban areas. That could be causing additional collisions, but this is challenging to prove from the trap definition. And then just lastly, if stopover intensity is driven by light pollution, how should these hotspots be prioritized? Do we just work to reduce the light pollution? Do we work to make it a softer buffer as birds enter into these urban areas? So I'll just leave it at that, and I thank you for your attention. Thanks.
The microphone's gotten very low. I can be quite short and still be effective. Thank you so much, Kyle. It's striking to me because, I'm hearing about the impacts from light pollution on, animals, but I think what's striking was, what it would look like when you compare it to us as well, right? Like a lot of the same elements that you're saying are influencing these species, are influencing us with regard to like our sleep patterns, our ability to be productive, and also our overall sense of worth, how we value things, and also, whether or not we're depressed or not. So, we're all kind of our own animal, right? And so I think that the implications of your work is broader than the birds alone. So very interesting. So last but not least, we're going to turn it now over to Scott. Thank you, Scott.
I'm going to try to raise this microphone up here. See if I can do that. Hi, everybody. Thank you for staying until the bitter end here. I appreciate that. Promise I'm going to be very respectful of your time. I won't go a minute longer than the 30 minutes limit that I have. I think it's 12 and now it's 11:43, so I probably should get started here. Thank you very much again. Much appreciated. Quick show of hands to keep things light here in the last presentation. How many economists do we have in the room? Okay, we'll talk after, sir. Excellent. All right, social scientists? Okay, a smattering more. So I'm an economist, I'm a social scientist, and that's where I fit into this whole situation of ecosystems, restoration, etc. So I'm going to take you through this presentation and focus on two things. We're going to start with a broad discussion of ecosystem services. Then secondly, I'm going to spin off into a case study in which I used a social ecological model to estimate the economic impacts of oyster reef restoration in the Chesapeake Bay. So what are ecosystem services? I love this definition from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment back in 2006. Hopefully it still stands as the one and true definition, concise and clear. Ecosystem services are the benefits people obtain from ecosystems. How clear is that? I love it. I don't like this definition. I saw this at a workshop the other day. Maybe one or two of you were there as well. And it's long, but the main problem I have with it, again, I'm a social scientist, I'm an economist, and I know when the ecologists get involved here and a biologist perhaps, they put their own spin on things, fair enough. But you can see the bolded text there, the value to a community or an ecosystem. So ecosystem services are the value to an ecosystem? I don't know. I'm not convinced. So yeah, types of ecosystem services. There's four key types. There's regulating services, there's supporting services, cultural services, and provisioning services. Regulating services, these are benefits to people from processes that moderate natural phenomena, such as flood control and carbon storage. Supporting services are services that really are at the heart of supporting life on planet Earth. Photosynthesis, nutrient cycling. There's cultural services, including nature-based music and art and that type of inspiration, recreation. So those are things that kind of enhance the human experience, on the planet. And then provisioning services, that's the extractive component. We're taking something out, fish, fuel, etc. So how do we get from restoration, environmental restoration, which has been something that's been talked about today a fair amount, to benefits? So it involves natural and social scientists, and we start in the natural scientist side, the structure of the environment, changing that structure. The structure changes, the function changes. Still not in my wheelhouse, but in many of your wheelhouses. And then we move on to the services and ultimately benefits and potentially monetizing those benefits. What I'll talk about here in a moment is restored oyster reefs, changing fish abundance. What people care about is catching fish, increased fish harvest, and then ultimately, at least on the commercial side, commercial fishing revenue. And again, we have the ecological out there in the front, and then the social aspect, on the end there. So one way we can do this is using these so-called coupled ecological social models. There's two key types of these models. There's a one-way coupled model and the two-way coupled model. The one-way coupled model is one direction. Often it's the natural system being changed. There's an output from that. That output serves as an input into the social system, and then you can monetize those benefits in some cases. Now, the two-way coupled model is more complex. As you can see, there's feedbacks and linkages. The social system affects the natural system, which then in turn affects the social system, and so on. So much more complicated. I like uncomplicated. So I've stuck to the one-way coupled social ecological model, at least for this example here. And I use that model, me and my team use that model to explore the changes in commercial fishery-related regional economic impacts resulting from oyster reef restoration. And the focus was in the Chesapeake Bay and the Eastern Shore and the Choptank River system. And there it is right there. This is a extensive and expensive endeavor. There's about 1,000 acres restored at this point, several billion oysters planted. That's B, several billion oysters planted. An estimated cost well north of 50 million. It's probably actually about $70 million at this point. And that's all part of the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement to restore 10 tributaries in the bay by 2025. So those have been restored, or the restoration is complete. And now there's 2 more tributaries that are being restored in Maryland as we speak. So we showed from restoration to benefits here. We talked about the coupled ecological social model, and here is it in action. Again, I'm the economist, so I stayed in my lane. I had people in their lane that know how to model ecosystems, model the animals and the habitat. And they did that through a tool called EcoPath, a food web model of an oyster reef. And that food web model of an oyster reef ultimately produced changes in fisheries landings that can be quantified or translated into revenues, which then were fed into a economic model called IMPLAN that calculates regional economic impacts in terms of employment, sales, and income. So our goal was to understand what the impacts were in these different potential scenarios that were possible outcomes of the restoration, and then also pre-restoration. So we had a no reef scenario, which was designed to be representative of what that reef system was like when there really wasn't a reef. It had been fished down substantially. There was not a meaningful oyster reef or oyster population there. And then there's a young restored reef several years after restoration. And then there's a mature restored reef, which was the reef that would exist if that reef were to be successfully restored and prevented from some kind of, change in policy, because there's a lot of pressure amongst commercial watermen to harvest those oysters or to, otherwise, kind of get in there and do some of the activities that they were able to do before it became a sanctuary. So here's a couple of the key findings from the ecological model. There's a large predicted increase in blue crab harvest with the oyster reef restoration. Blue crabs comprise about 3/4 of the total dockside value of Maryland Chesapeake Bay fishery revenues each year. So that is a big deal. A mature oyster reef was estimated to support increase in harvest of about 160% relative to the no reef scenario. There was a large increase in white perch harvest, 650%. It's a very small piece of the pie in terms of the fisheries economics of the Maryland Chesapeake Bay. So it really wasn't majorly impactful in the grand scheme of things with the regional economic impact analysis. So we have these harvests. Now it's time to translate the harvest into revenues. Took a very simple approach here. We have the total harvest in pounds, multiply that by the species-specific per pound prices. My economist friend over there in the room may be wondering whether, well, you're increasing the supply, how would that affect prices? So we deferred on that. Essentially, the Choptank River is a small part of a large seafood market in the Bay and in the East Coast. So we expected no effect on prices as harvest increased. Translating revenues into impacts. So we have these revenues now. We feed those into the regional economic impact analysis software called IMPLAN. So what IMPLAN does is it estimates the ripple effect of those dockside sales through the regional economy. So the fishers sell their catch at the dock, but they had to purchase bait to make those catches. They had to add fuel to their vessel to make those catches. Probably had to repair their vessel as part of their annual expenditures. So we know how these industries are related, how the spending is occurring, and that allows us to estimate regional economic impacts from the changes in harvest associated with the changes in the level of oyster reef restoration. Key findings here, annual dockside values. We project an increase in annual dockside values of $11 million annually, and that's comparing, again, the mature reef state to the no reef scenario. And then there are the ripple effects. So what are the total sales effects? And we project that that would be just about $23 million, again, comparing the mature oyster reef state to the no reef scenario. So I kept it under 30 minutes. I'm at 11 and a half. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you all today. Yep.
I think we ended on a high note. Scott's clearly a rebellious spirit. Let's all remember the line, "No fish is an island." Now's the time, we had a lot of dynamic presentations. We are at the end of the day, but there's still more to come. There's a poster session. You can grab some drinks. I'll remind you of that in a few minutes. But before we end, it's a time to ask questions of all of our panelists on the work that they're doing, what they get excited about in the future. And so before I hog the questions, I wanted to turn it over to all of you to see if you have any questions for our speakers. Yes, and Laura is going to run around. Oh, yeah, at the end of the day.
Hi, thank you so much. Great talks. My question is for David. You had some maps of Africa and trees outside forested regions, and I don't think you went as far as saying we should be planting trees across Africa, but it seems that your work kind of is pushing up against that topic. Do you have any comments on the huge controversies around planting trees across Africa?
I mean, you're saying North Africa?
No, just in general, Africa.
Am I recommending planting trees in Africa?
Yes.
Yes, I am.
I'm also. My question was if you could comment on the controversy of that recommendation.
Oh, yeah, sure. I could. I think, but I can't do that unless we have another half hour, probably. So I think there's always concern, not so much about whether it's good to have trees in the landscape in these communities, because they do that traditionally. And one of the advantages of a trees outside of forest strategy is it leverages actually off of traditional practices. And there's a lot of literature on that sort of thing. I think the controversy comes when it gets complicated by who's involved and who benefits. Right? In particular, are these big projects of tree planting? Are the projects genetic deserts as plantations? Even those smallholders plant little tiny genetic deserts all the time in Africa, small plantations of eucalyptus and things like that. But are they those kinds of big scale kinds of things, or are they small scale community-based engagement with the communities? Who benefits? Now, if you're talking about, I heard today a recommendation that the program should get into the carbon markets. I think that's interesting because actually the ideas are much more broad than specifically carbon markets. The whole area of carbon finance involves a lot of different ways, from NGOs and community support organizations to philanthropy to the Green Carbon Fund, Climate Fund, those sorts of things. And so those kinds of issues are going to be complicated to work out. But what I see as positive on the horizon is I see a lot of efforts being done by local-based NGOs that are working sometimes with international support to do maintenance of the tree base that is already there, especially in places that are using tree-based products, and increasing the use of trees in some places. But it can be a challenging kind of discussion, I think. I'm welcome to hear your comment. Okay. Yeah, sure. I think it's an interesting thing. And of course, I only touched on one piece about, which I think is important, is the measurement and the monitoring of carbon, right?
I'm a savanna ecologist, so that I will declare my bias at the beginning. The points you made were very interesting, but I think that these kind of global, not global, but like continental maps of Africa is just some kind of like potential carbon sink for the global north by planting up ecosystems that shouldn't have trees in them in the first place is a dangerous kind of road to walk down.
Yeah, let me respond to that because I thought about that before you asked the question. I was thinking, I should have said something like this, and I didn't. And that is that there are really two things in my presentation. One is the advancement of basic scientific research and some questions about how much carbon and how much tree cover really is at the continental scale of Africa. We really don't know, right? And so these big maps of Africa are not necessarily intended to say, these are targets for planting, these are targets for investments and things like that. There's that scientific issue that relates to global change research, the global carbon cycle, where I work, that's very important. The step down, though, was that same approach can be applied at the community level or at the intervention level in the landscape around communities that are restoring their landscapes for the most part under the AFR, the Forest and Landscape Restoration Initiative following the Barn Challenge. And that's a different kind of thing, but that's the kind of interesting aspect is you have scientific benefits and direct applications at the same time. So thanks for your question. Good.
Yeah, I'm Peter Griffith from NASA Goddard. So I have a question that I'm calling Beyond These Walls. And I wanted to ask it after the lunch session, but I've adapted it for this group. And if anybody who spoke right after lunch is still here, then, catch me afterwards or something. So the first question is any one of you can reflect on, anybody in the room can. How well do you think your models describe the vulnerability of social systems to climate risks? Some people talked about that or at least touched on it. Are you concerned or alarmed? And then the question you can address either of those out loud if you wish. And then really the heart of it is how do you communicate your level of concern to people outside this box and outside the boxes that are highly constrained like the WEF or the IPCC, which have extraordinarily narrow terms under which concern and risk can be discussed. Anybody want to take that? That's a hot potato.
Okay, I can start it. Notoriously poor memory. So Peter, I'm not sure I can answer them all, except the second one in terms of being concerned, I guess, in terms of boreal forest, I would even say maybe beyond boreal forest to other forest ecosystems. I think we'll see a lot of dynamics in the coming decades, and that seems to be picking up. So a lot of disturbance. I do think those systems are quite resilient. Where I get into maybe borderline alarm is, and I didn't speak about this at all, but in these high latitude systems, as you know, and there's no doubt others in the room, permafrost is really the big deal and the big question there, and how rapidly permafrost will degrade and the rapidly increasing emissions associated with that. So that's where I think that's, for me at least, that's something that actually qualifies as a potential tipping point situation where we get into something that really can escalate beyond our control. And in a relatively short amount of time in the coming decades. So I think, along with others I know in this room who are trying to make some inroads into the policy arena there and to get permafrost carbon accounted for in climate change negotiations and potentially even in the nationally determined commitments that countries have already made. So that's not answering all three of your questions, but that's maybe one of them, and I'll pass it on.
All right, I'll add something here. So, climate change, you don't often hear about it discussed in the positive because it's not 99.98% of the time. With respect to the blue crabs in the Chesapeake Bay, it is anticipated to be a positive thing for by far the most valuable fishery. And that's what the top blue crab scientists are projecting. But then there's the interaction with the invasive species and how that'll come into play, which is not well understood or considered. Blue catfish and snakehead blue catfish are major invasive of the bay and are known to just chow down on blue crab. So even, you have the blue crab, we're at the northern end, we're at the northern end of their range here, so presumably they would benefit, but then there's the invasive species factor. So many things come into play. It's hard to even make a guess how it would actually play out in reality, even though superficially it might seem like more blue crabs for everybody, but I don't know that that'll be the case. Yeah.
I would also add that one of the things that's needed most in the international dialogue over climate change mitigation and adaptation is improved and highly accurate measurement and monitoring. I've been involved with the carbon financial markets in the past. I was kind of a charter member of the Chicago Climate Exchange when it existed. I worked in the California program. I worked in the European programs and some other things. And inevitably, what they say is we don't want scientific level accuracy, which kind of freaks people out sometimes, because that not in this market, And what they need is sometimes just an assertion that things are going in the right direction. You are increasing carbon versus you're not, things of that nature. And the reason for that is because in this area, there are other instruments available to protect against uncertainty, right? So for instance, in the carbon financial markets that I heard somebody mention today, the carbon financial instrument embeds in it a number of other instruments that allow you to mediate against uncertainty, error, and risk by lowering the price or changing the terms and conditions and all these kinds of things. We scientists walk into that environment and sometimes we're just mortified, but it actually does, on its best days work. So one of the challenges is how do we mesh the necessary accuracy that we see for our models and our measurements against what can be tolerated in the application?
Yeah, I'm wondering about the relationship between diversity and all these other metrics that we want to ascribe as emergent properties of ecosystems like resistance, resilience, and all that. A lot of those assessments are very context dependent. Depends on what you're measuring. Are you looking at biomass? Are you looking at productivity? Are you looking at nitrogen retention? I'm wondering if people have thought about what is the rule of thumb or what is the minimum number of variables that we should be measuring to make these assessments, or is that even possible? Or is it different for an aquatic, freshwater system than a coral reef than a savanna? And we need to also know those. So it's very open-ended, but it's what I struggle all the time when I'm trying to make assessments of this.
That's a great question, and I don't think we have, I think you're exactly right. It's not resolved. I think one way to think about that though might be there's the development of the essential biodiversity variables and how those aspire to be, I'll say, the sort of a small set of characteristics of a system that are related to the functioning of that system. So, maybe in that framework, there's a space for identifying some common set of characteristics of an ecosystem and then how those play into ecosystem services.
Yeah, and I would just, here we go. Okay, and I would just add, in terms of the M bond, we've actually spent a lot of time thinking about what was called, what did we call it? It's similar to essential biodiversity variables, but it just thinking about what are the scales at which the different organizational levels of biodiversity at which we measure. If we go out and we can measure functional diversity, for example, how well are we characterizing, that was what I was trying to say, characteristic biodiversity, but how well are we characterizing genomic diversity? And is there some sort of relationship that is quantifiable that we can extrapolate through space that genomic diversity is going to hold true for a given functional diversity? And that's really, it's super, super tricky because we're not measuring everything, right? And in the ocean, for example, every time we go out and we measure and we're trying to do a rarefaction, our plot has drifted away. And so it makes it even a little more challenging. And so I think we think about it and it's things that keep us up awake at night, but I don't have any answers yet for it.
Hi, this is sparked by Adam's question. So my name is Cherie Forbes. I'm from the Bioscape project, but I think anyone on the panel could answer it. So I was thinking about the call for action that Adam mentioned and us as a community being those people that are interested in this topic and that others may look at. And where the remote sensing scientists are thinking about monitoring the past. So how often are we looking back more than 50 years? Thinking about like before industrialization and using applied paleoecology as a way to calibrate our data and think about whether we've shifted into a different regime, or some systems are in a spot where they are resisting. There has been a change, but they're resisting. And wouldn't that be something that remote sensing could leverage? Because I think there is a lot of paleo data out there.
I'll just comment to say I agree totally. And actually, I had a slide in there and I just ran out of time to get into it. So absolutely, I think the deeper, that's what I was getting at when I said something like deeper past. But I think having that longer term perspective, I think it does two things. It can give us an idea of how resilient our ecosystems actually are, right? Like if, I'm from Buffalo, New York, which was under 2 miles of ice not that long ago, right? In the grand scheme of things. And it's now a very vibrant ecosystem. And so I think in general, nature is quite resilient. And if we're, the smaller your picture looks, you might get crazy ideas one way or the other. So I think being able to compare what we see over the recent past with the, multi-decadal past, with the multi-century past, with the multi-thousands of years past is critical.
I was going to say, one of my dearest colleagues is a foraminifera ecologist, and so we've discussed this in the past too, in terms of linking the biogeography of the extant forams to remote sensing, because currently what the kind of the status quo of that is that the edges of boundaries are very, very static and don't take into consideration changes in circulation or event scale processes, and so I think that that's going to be a really cool thing going forward into the future and to, determine that. So next question.
Excellent. Okay, well, with that, we're going to end today's session. I want to thank all the speakers for their dynamic insights and the calls to action that we heard today. Hopefully all of you